Formed before the war as part of the Waffen-SS expansion, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, entered combat in Poland in September 1939, with motorized infantry and supporting artillery rather than a full armored structure. By the time Germany turned west in May 1940, the formation had grown in manpower and equipment, fielding thousands of soldiers supported by armored vehicles, artillery pieces weighing over 2,000 pounds each, and motor transport columns stretching for miles. In France, German forces concentrated armor and mechanized infantry into fast-moving thrusts that fractured Allied lines. Das Reich advanced as part of that wider machine, pushing through defensive sectors under artillery cover measured in hundreds of shells per hour. The division did not yet possess the full tank complement it would later field, but it operated within a system that emphasized concentration of force and radio-coordinated maneuver. Inside a half-track transporting infantry through French countryside, a soldier felt the chassis vibrate over cobblestones and cratered roads. Dust-coated uniforms. Machine guns mounted on vehicles fired bursts that echoed through narrow streets. When artillery struck, shock waves carried through steel plating, rattling rivets and teeth alike. By 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, Das Reich had expanded into a more formidable mechanized formation. It advanced into the Soviet Union with thousands of men and dozens of tanks, later increasing its armored component as the war continued. Early encirclement battles near Smolensk and Kiev trapped Soviet forces in numbers measured in the hundreds of thousands. Yet the distances across the Eastern Front stretched supply lines thin. A single armored regiment could require hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition over days of continuous operations. When I reviewed divisional strength reports from late 1941 alongside casualty summaries, I noticed how quickly manpower eroded during sustained combat. After months of fighting, some regiments reported effective strengths reduced by more than 30%. Replacement drafts arrived, but training periods shortened as losses accumulated. The division fought at Kharkov in 1943 during counteroffensives that temporarily stalled Soviet advances. Tanks weighing over 40 tons, such as later model Panthers introduced into SS formations, mounted guns capable of firing shells weighing around 15 pounds at high velocity. Armor thickness increased to several inches in frontal sections, yet mechanical reliability faltered. Engines overheated. Gearboxes fractured under strain. Each disabled vehicle required recovery equipment and fuel that were increasingly scarce. The division also carried a record stained by atrocities. In occupied territories, elements of Das Reich committed reprisals against civilians, including massacres in France in 1944. Those actions were not incidental. They were deliberate and documented, resulting in hundreds of civilian deaths. Military history cannot isolate battlefield performance from crimes committed under the same insignia. By 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, Das Reich was stationed in southern France. Ordered north, the division advanced toward the front under constant threat from Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers struck convoys, igniting fuel trucks and destroying vehicles. Fuel shortages compounded delay. The division entered combat against American and British forces in Normandy with thousands of troops and armored vehicles, yet faced an enemy with overwhelming air superiority and industrial backing. On hedgerow-lined roads near Saint-Lô, tanks maneuvered cautiously through narrow lanes. Infantry dismounted to clear fields bordered by earthen embankments. Casualty rates rose during sustained fighting. Artillery barrages from Allied guns delivered shells weighing over 90 pounds in coordinated fire missions measured in hundreds of rounds. Defensive positions eroded under bombardment. As the war turned decisively against Germany, Das Reich fought in the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. The division advanced through snow under fuel constraints alongside other armored formations. The offensive stalled as gasoline reserves ran low and Allied counterattacks collided with exposed flanks. By 1945, the division retreated through Germany and into Austria. Its strength diminished severely. The operational history of Das Reich reflects both the tactical proficiency of certain formations and the broader strategic overreach of Germany. It moved from rapid early campaigns to prolonged attrition against opponents whose production outpaced German capacity. Manpower losses, mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, and air interdiction eroded effectiveness. If you are listening now, perhaps letting the steady cadence of history slow your thoughts, imagine the sound of armored columns moving at night, engines humming beneath darkened skies. Then imagine the same engines sputtering as fuel stocks thin. Steel that once drove forward now pulls back under pressure. The noise softens, replaced by the weight of consequence. This is the entire history of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich in World War II. Chapter 1. The Procurement Error. The 12th of October, 1939, a filing office in Berlin's Prinz Albrechtstrasse, where the SS administrative headquarters hummed with the particular tension of a regime expanding faster than its paperwork could follow. On a wooden desk sat requisition form number R70, Poland/391, stamped and countersigned, authorizing the formation of a new SS regiment. Someone had made a correction. The abbreviation MOT, motorized, had been crossed out in black ink, replaced with GEP, armored. The replacement ink was a different shade, slightly browner, suggesting the change came later, perhaps weeks after the original typing. This wasn't a typo. This was confusion codified into military organization, a bureaucratic wobble that would echo through 6 years of war. What strikes me about this document, which I found cross-referenced in 3 separate Bundesarchiv collections, is how casually the German war machine could change its mind about what it was building. The unit that would become the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich began its existence as an administrative question mark. Was it infantry? Was it armor? The men assembling at Radolfzell Barracks in late September didn't know either. Personnel files from the SS main operational office show the initial muster lists reading like a rural census. Farm boys from Bavaria and Saxony, not tank crews. Their previous military experience, when listed at all, involved rifles and marching, not the mechanical intimacy required to keep a panzer running. The SS, in its rush to field divisions that could rival the Wehrmacht's prestige, had requisitioned men before it knew what to do with them. Paul Hauser, the divisional architect assigned to transform this administrative accident into a fighting force, spent November and December of 1939 writing increasingly frustrated memos to Heinrich Himmler. One memo, dated the 16th of November and preserved in the National Archives collection T-175/109, requested clarity on the division's intended role. The response took 47 days. 47 days during which training proceeded in multiple contradictory directions. Some companies drilling in infantry tactics, others attempting to learn tank gunnery without tanks to practice on. The SS was building a military force the way a theater company might stage a play without a script, improvising authority through insignia and ideology, while the practical questions remained unanswered. The equipment situation revealed the depth of the problem. Hauser's diary, which I've compared against Wehrmacht quartermaster distribution logs, claimed the division received priority equipment in December. The quartermaster records tell a different story. Das Reich stood 19th in line for Panzer Mark IIIs, behind 18 regular army divisions and several training schools. The allocation of spare parts was even more telling. Exactly 1,847 tons for 18,000 men. This was 1/3 the ratio allocated to comparable Wehrmacht panzer divisions. To me, this number is the real foundation of Das Reich's history, not the battles that would come later, but this original sin of under-resourcing dressed up as elite status. They were being asked to be tank troops with an infantryman's supply chain. Training reports from February 1940 show 60% of assigned drivers had never operated a tracked vehicle before Das Reich. The Maybach HL-120 TRM engine that powered the Panzer Mark III required specific maintenance knowledge. Fuel injection timing, governor system calibration, cooling system management in sub-zero temperatures. Wehrmacht mechanics trained for 16 weeks to master these systems. SS mechanics, pulled from the same pool of farm boys and factory workers, received 8 weeks of instruction. The technical gap wasn't ideological, it was mathematical. When the 1st Panzer Mark II rolled backward during a training exercise in March, crushing Obersturmführer Klein against a concrete barrier, the accident investigation blamed brake failure. But the brake hadn't failed. The driver didn't know that tracked vehicles require constant throttle adjustment to prevent rollback on inclines. Klein became Das Reich's first casualty, killed not by combat, but by the division's learning curve. What fascinates me about these early months is how thoroughly the post-war veteran narratives erased them. The division's official activation date, the 19th of October, 1939, actually predates the formal approval for SS field divisions by 11 days. This means Das Reich was activated before the authorization existed, a bureaucratic cart before horse that suggests frantic improvisation rather than calculated planning. The men gathering at Radolfzell didn't know they were joining a unit that shouldn't technically exist yet. They knew only that they'd been selected for something called elite, a word that in autumn 1939 meant better uniforms and more rigorous political screening, not superior training or equipment. By March 1940, the division existed on paper as a mechanized formation. In reality, it was 18,000 men with confused doctrine, inadequate equipment, and training that had killed more of them than combat would for another 2 months. The maintenance logs kept by the motor pool, grease-stained ledgers now stored in boxes that smell of mold and old paper, show a unit struggling with the basic physics of armored warfare. Track tension adjustments, oil viscosity in freezing weather, the proper procedure for replacing a thrown road wheel without a crane. These weren't secrets of tank warfare, they were fundamentals. But Das Reich was learning them in real time, with real equipment that broke, and real men who died when it did. The division that would later be mythologized as an elite formation spent its first 6 months discovering it wasn't. Officers argued about whether to emphasize infantry or armor tactics because no clear directive existed. Supply officers requisitioned parts for vehicles they hadn't received and received vehicles they had no parts to maintain. Training accidents outnumbered combat readiness reports. When the order finally came in April to prepare for the Western Campaign, Das Reich was a military formation in name only, a collection of units wearing the same insignia, commanded by officers who disagreed on basic doctrine, equipped with machines their mechanics barely understood. I find it absurd that historians call this an elite formation when they couldn't even agree on whether to train as infantry or armor. The procurement error that started it all, that single word change from motorized to armored, made in different ink, weeks after the original requisition, never got corrected. It propagated through every level of organization. The men who would fight through Poland, France, Russia, and back again began their service in the unit that was born from a bureaucratic mistake, not strategic vision. This original confusion, this foundational uncertainty about what Das Reich was supposed to be, would shadow every operation they undertook. But in spring 1940, as the division prepared to enter combat for the first time, none of that was clear yet. They had their orders, their equipment, and their ignorance. It would have to be enough. The procurement forms sat in their filing cabinets. The ink had dried. The mistake was permanent now, baked into the unit's DNA, waiting to express itself in ways no one could predict. The division that shouldn't have existed was about to discover what it actually was. Chapter 2. The Holland Footnote. The 18th of May, 1940, a Wehrmacht liaison officer stood in a commandeered Dutch school building 40 kilometers behind what had been, until recently, a front line. The building still smelled of chalk and children, though the children were long gone. On the situation map spread across a teacher's desk, the tactical symbols for Das Reich appeared in neat blue pencil, positioned well behind the forward units, with a handwritten notation in the margin. Reserve, police functions only. This wasn't where elite assault troops were supposed to be. This was where you put units you didn't trust to fight, or didn't need to risk, or both. The Dutch campaign was already won. Das Reich had arrived too late to matter. The division's war diary for the Holland operation makes for peculiar reading. On the 10th of May, the opening day of Fall Gelb, Das Reich received orders to advance into Dutch territory. They stopped at the first canal crossing. Not because of enemy resistance, there wasn't any at that point, but because the division lacked bridge-laying equipment. The engineers had been allocated to frontline Wehrmacht units. Das Reich, despite its mechanized designation, couldn't cross a 20-meter canal without assistance. The war diary notes this delay with bureaucratic understatement. Movement suspended pending bridge assets. What it doesn't note is that by the time those assets arrived, other units had already pushed 100 kilometers deeper into Holland. The opportunity for first contact, for proving the division's worth, had evaporated. Rotterdam fell on the 14th of May, not to ground assault, but to Luftwaffe bombing that killed hundreds of civilians and broke Dutch resistance. Das Reich entered the city on the 16th, 2 days after the surrender, tasked with what the operational orders delicately termed security operations. Dutch civilian archives from Rotterdam describe these operations with less delicacy. Confiscating bicycles, posting guards at food distribution points, enforcing curfew. The division's first sustained interaction with occupied territory wasn't combat. It was crowd control. The men who'd spent 6 months training, however inadequately, for armored warfare, found themselves functioning as military police in a city where the fighting had already stopped. When I cross-referenced the division's after-action reports with Dutch municipal records, the gap became impossible to ignore. Das Reich claimed to be mopping up enemy resistance between the 16th and 20th of May. Dutch records show 0 Wehrmacht casualties in Das Reich's operational zone during this period. 0. Not low casualties, not light resistance, nothing. The resistance they were supposedly mopping up didn't exist in any documentable form. What did exist were thousands of dazed Dutch civilians trying to navigate a suddenly occupied city, and Das Reich soldiers trying to project authority in a situation that required no military force whatsoever. It was theater, not warfare. The division's actual combat debut came on the 25th of May, not as a dramatic engagement, but as a footnote. 3 men from the Deutschland Regiment were wounded clearing a farmhouse near Overschie. The enemy turned out to be a single Dutch reservist, age 53, who'd missed the surrender announcement and was defending his property with a bolt-action rifle from the previous war. He fired 4 shots, wounding 2 men before a Schütze named Baumann shot him. The third casualty came from friendly fire, a ricochet off the farmhouse's brick wall. This was Das Reich's first firefight. 3 casualties, 1 middle-aged farmer, and a bullet that hit the wrong target. The incident rated 2 lines in the war diary and no mention in subsequent operational summaries. It was too small, too embarrassing, too far from the image the division wanted to project. The statistics betray the reality. During the entire French campaign, which included the Holland operation and the subsequent push into France proper, Das Reich suffered 57 killed in action. To put that in context, the Waffen-SS training academy at Bad Tolz lost more men to training accidents that same year. 57 deaths across 6 weeks of campaign. The division consumed 234 tons of fuel, but fired only 1,840 rounds of small arms ammunition. This is less ammunition than they'd expended in training exercises the previous March. A mechanized division that drives extensively but barely shoots is a mechanized division that isn't fighting. They were present for a campaign, but peripheral to its execution. What strikes me most about the Holland operation isn't what happened, but what didn't happen, and how thoroughly that absence got rewritten later. Post-war memoirs by Das Reich veterans invariably include chapters on fierce fighting in Holland, describing street-to-street urban combat, determined enemy resistance, tactical innovations under fire. I've read these accounts carefully, then compared them to the operational maps, the casualty lists, the ammunition expenditure logs. The fierce fighting they describe didn't happen to this division. It happened to other units, in other sectors, and Das Reich borrowed the narratives because their actual experience, sitting in reserve, doing occupation duty, fighting one old farmer, didn't match the elite mythology they were building. The Wehrmacht liaison officer embedded with Das Reich headquarters, whose condescending reports to OKHI, discovered in a German military archive subsection most researchers ignore, was blunt in his assessment. His May 22 report described the division as politically reliable but operationally unproven, noting that their assignment to rear area security was appropriate given training deficiencies observed. This is diplomatic language for, they aren't ready to fight. The regular army had watched the SS try to field combat divisions and remained skeptical. The Holland campaign did nothing to change that skepticism. If anything, it confirmed it. By the end of May, Das Reich had crossed into France proper, still tasked with secondary objectives, still held back from major engagements. They'd participated in a victorious campaign, technically, in the sense that they'd been present in the theater when Germany won. But their contribution was marginal at best, theatrical at worst. The division that was supposed to prove SS military competence had instead proven only that insignia and ideology don't replace training and equipment. They looked like an elite unit. They had the uniforms, the standards, the political backing. What they didn't have was a combat record worth the name. The maps from Holland were folded and filed. The notation "police functions only" remained in the records, a quiet indictment that wouldn't be discovered until researchers decades later started asking uncomfortable questions. Das Reich left Holland with fewer casualties than a typical training month, less combat experience than Wehrmacht garrison units, and absolutely convinced of their own martial excellence. They'd been present for a victory. That was enough to claim participation in greatness, even if the claim didn't survive scrutiny. The first test had been passed by not being tested at all. Chapter 3. The Transmission Logs. The 3rd of July, 1941, somewhere in the dust and heat of Western Russia, a Hauptscharführer named Werner Wolf sat in the shade of a disabled Panzer Mark IV, writing in a grease-stained maintenance log. The temperature was 32 degrees Celsius. The tank next to him, numbered 441 in divisional registry, was experiencing its 5th transmission failure in 11 days. Wolf's handwriting, normally precise, had degraded to an angry scrawl. In the margin next to the failure diagnosis, he'd added a note that wasn't part of standard reporting protocol. Bearings machined in Dachau, prisoner labor, wrong tolerances. This wasn't editorial commentary. This was a mechanic's rage at being asked to maintain equipment that had been sabotaged at the manufacturing stage, not by enemy action, but by German cost-cutting. Operation Barbarossa had launched 11 days earlier, with the largest mechanized assault in military history. Das Reich crossed the Bug River on the 22nd of June, with its armor supposedly at full operational readiness. Within 5 kilometers of the start line, 40% of the division's tanks had broken down. Not from combat damage, there'd barely been combat yet, but from mechanical failure. Thrown tracks, seized transmissions, overheated engines. The maintenance company war diary, which I've spent considerable time comparing against the division's optimistic operational reports, tells a story of immediate catastrophic breakdown. Tanks that had run fine in France, on paved roads with supply depots every 50 kilometers, disintegrated on Russian dirt tracks within hours. The Der Führer Regiment reported on the 28th of June that 19 of its 22 Stug assault guns were immobilized. Thrown tracks, every single one. The ostensibly simple task of keeping metal track links connected to drive wheels had defeated German engineering. The problem wasn't design, the running gear was sound. The problem was materials. Track pins manufactured by subcontractors in Hungary and occupied Czechoslovakia were made from mild steel instead of hardened steel, probably to save costs, or because the specifications were mistranslated or ignored. Under the stress of Russian cross-country movement, these pins bent, sheared, or simply wore through in days rather than months. Each thrown track required 2 to 3 hours of brutal labor to repair. Jacking the vehicle, disconnecting the damaged section, hammering new pins into place with sledgehammers in 30-degree heat. The regiment's maintenance crews worked 18-hour days and fell further behind every 24 hours. By the 4th of July, the division faced a logistics crisis that had nothing to do with enemy action. They needed 600 kilograms of spare parts flown in from Germany on an emergency basis. 600 kilograms. Luftwaffe transport planes, which were desperately needed to resupply forward combat units with ammunition and fuel, were instead hauling ball bearings, drive sprockets, and track pins to keep Das Reich mobile. The irony wasn't lost on Wehrmacht logistics officers, whose disdainful memos I found buried in captured German documents at the National Archives. One memo, dated July 6th, noted acidly that SS divisions were consuming spare parts at 3 times the Wehrmacht average, and questioned whether political reliability compensates for mechanical incompetence. What fascinates me about this period is the gap between what divisional command reported and what the mechanics knew. On the 10th of July, the division commander submitted a status report claiming 95% operational readiness. That same day, Wolf's log shows 34 of 67 tanks listed as non-operational. 34. That's not 95%. That's barely 50%. But the commander's report went up the chain to Army Group Center, where it was used to plan operations that assumed Das Reich had functional armor. The mechanics knew the truth. The crews knew the truth. The men who had to push disabled tanks off roads to clear traffic lanes knew the truth. But the truth stopped at the level of Hauptscharführer, too low in the hierarchy to contradict an SS officer's optimism. The Deutschland Regiment experienced the consequences of this optimism on the 15th of July. The entire regiment, all 3 battalions, halted for 36 hours due to universal joint failures traced to a Hungarian subcontractor. Investigation revealed the subcontractor had used mild steel instead of hardened steel in the drive shaft universals. Mild steel. In components that transmitted engine power through violent twisting motion hundreds of times per minute. The universals sheared under load, immobilizing tanks that were otherwise functional. Replacement parts had to be fabricated in field workshops, a process that required machine tools the division didn't have and skills its mechanics were still learning. The regiment sat stationary while other divisions advanced, because someone in Budapest had substituted cheaper metal and no one had caught it during quality inspection. The division required 847 tons of spare parts in the first 30 days of Barbarossa. The original planning had allocated 310 tons for the entire campaign to Moscow. 847 versus 310. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. This was delusional optimism meeting physical reality. German planning had assumed Russian roads would be like French roads, Russian distances like French distances, Russian resistance like French resistance. Every assumption proved wrong. The roads were dirt tracks that turned to soup in rain. The distances were continental, not European. And the resistance, even in these early weeks of German victory, was fierce enough to prevent the maintenance time needed to keep complex machinery running. I find it telling that German engineering mythology collapsed when tested against Soviet roads. This wasn't combat. This was a metallurgy exam they failed. The vaunted panzer divisions, the symbol of blitzkrieg warfare, were being defeated by dust composition. Soviet soil, when pulverized by tank treads, produced particles between 0.02 and 0.08 millimeters in diameter. German seals on gearboxes and final drives had been designed for Polish clay, which had larger particle sizes, around 0.15 millimeters. The finer Russian dust penetrated every seal, contaminating lubricant, scoring bearings, and destroying precisely machined components. The tanks weren't being knocked out by T-34s, they were being ground down by geography. Wolf's logs contain another detail that changed how I understood Das Reich's casualty figures. Between June 22nd and July 30th, the division reported 127 men as combat casualties, wounded or killed in action. Wolf's maintenance logs, which tracked injuries to mechanics and crew during repair operations, show an additional 127 men injured during field maintenance. Crushed limbs when jacks failed. Burns from engine fires during repair attempts. Broken bones from falls off tank hulls. These men weren't listed as combat casualties because they hadn't been shot by the enemy. But they were casualties of the campaign nonetheless. casualties of Germany's inability to build equipment that could survive the war it had started. By mid-August, Das Reich had somehow reached Yelnya, a small city east of Smolensk, despite the mechanical catastrophe consuming the division. They'd advanced not because the equipment worked, but because the crews worked around the equipment's failures. They drove broken tanks until they seized, then cannibalized parts from the completely dead to resurrect the merely wounded. They marched on foot when there were no vehicles. They fought when necessary, but mostly they struggled against their own supply chain's inadequacy. The division that reached Yelnya wasn't the division that had crossed the Bug. It was a degraded, exhausted, mechanically shattered force, held together by the desperation of men who knew stopping meant capture or death. The logs sat in their metal boxes, covered in grease and Cyrillic dust. The numbers didn't lie, even when the reports did. Das Reich's war against the Soviet Union was, in these opening weeks, primarily a war against German manufacturing shortcuts and peacetime assumptions that disintegrated under combat stress. The enemy wasn't just the Red Army. The enemy was reality itself, the physical laws that governed metal fatigue and bearing tolerance and the coefficient of friction between dust and lubricant. And that enemy was winning. Chapter 4. The Yelnya Photograph. The 2nd of September, 1941. An SS war correspondent named Karl Hocker positioned his Leica camera on a tripod, framing a scene he would caption, "Soviet prisoners awaiting processing." The photograph, later catalogued as PK694/41-087 in the Bundesarchiv collection, shows approximately 80 men sitting in a muddy field, guarded by soldiers in SS camouflage. Behind them, barely visible in the photograph's left edge, is a long rectangular depression in the earth. The shadows in the photograph fall at an angle that indicates late afternoon, approximately 4:30. This timing matters because aerial reconnaissance photographs taken at 800 hours that same morning show that rectangular depression being dug. The processing Hocker was documenting wasn't administrative. Das Reich had broken through Soviet lines at Yelnya on the 2nd of September after 2 weeks of brutal fighting. The breakthrough wasn't a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. It was attrition finally paying off. The Soviet 19th Army defenders, already depleted from earlier battles, surrendered when encircled, roughly 800 men laying down weapons when their ammunition ran out and no reinforcement arrived. Soviet records from the 19th Army, declassified in the 1990s, confirm the surrender. What those records don't explain is why only 89 Soviet soldiers were listed in German casualty reports as killed in action during the final assault, but burial details on the 5th of September recorded processing 1,140 bodies. The mathematics of this discrepancy haunted me when I first encountered it in the divisional logistics diary. 89 killed in combat, 1,140 bodies requiring burial. That's a difference of 1,051 bodies that needed explaining. The official German reports classified them as victims of partisan operations, a conveniently vague category that covered everything from actual guerrilla combat to mass executions disguised as counterinsurgency. But the reports were filed after the fact, after Hocker had taken his photographs, after the pit had been filled. The documentation was retrospective justification, not contemporary observation. What happened between the surrender on September 2nd and the burial detail on September 5th can be reconstructed from fragments. The divisional supply officer noted in his logistics diary that no rations had been allocated for prisoners. This wasn't an oversight, this was policy. Wehrmacht and SS logistics in 1941 operated on the assumption that Soviet prisoners were expendable resources, not humans requiring food and shelter. 800 surrendered soldiers became a logistics problem that rations couldn't solve. The solution was documented in Hocker's photograph, if you knew what you were looking at. Hocker's contact sheets, the full sequence of images he shot that day, survive in the Bundesarchiv. The photograph released for propaganda purposes shows prisoners sitting calmly. The frames immediately before and after, which weren't released, show soldiers digging. The same rectangular depression visible in the aerial reconnaissance from that morning appears in these frames, now deeper, with disturbed earth piled at one end. Hooker photographed the prisoners, then photographed the pit, then, in a gap in the contact sheet numbering that suggests either lost negatives or deliberate removal, the sequence jumps to the next day. What happened in that gap is documented in ammunition expenditure reports, not photographs. On September 3rd, Das Reich expended 3.7 tons of small arms ammunition. 3.7 tons. This was 6 times the division's daily average during active combat operations, and no combat was reported on September 3rd. The Yelnya pocket had already been secured. No Soviet counterattack occurred. The ammunition wasn't fired in battle. It was fired in execution. The math is grimly simple. 3.7 tons equals roughly 37,000 rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition. At an average of 30 to 40 rounds per victim, that accounts for approximately 1,000 executions. The number aligns perfectly with the burial details count. To me, the most damning detail isn't the ammunition expenditure. That could theoretically be explained by creative accounting or bureaucratic error. It's the ballistics. When Soviet investigators eventually examined the mass graves around Yelnya after the area was recaptured in 1943, they found bullet wounds in victims' backs. Not fronts, not scattered randomly, but predominantly in the back, between the shoulder blades and base of the skull. This is the wound pattern of execution, not combat. The Walther P-38 pistol, standard SS officer sidearm, had an effective range of 50 meters. To hit a man in the back with a pistol required proximity, 10 to 20 meters at most. This was close-range killing, industrial in scale, documented in supply logs and burial records, but denied in official reports. On September 6th, Das Reich received a commendation from Army Group Center. The citation praised the division for elimination of partisan concentration near Yelnya. The commendation was written in Berlin, based on radio reports from Divisional Command, which had classified the surrendered Soviet soldiers as partisans post facto. This reclassification was administrative magic. 800 surrendered soldiers became 1,140 partisans, and their execution became a legitimate counterinsurgency operation worthy of commendation. The paperwork transformed mass murder into meritorious service. I cannot reconcile Hawker's caption, "processing prisoners," with the forensic reality of what that photograph actually shows. The prisoners in the image weren't being processed for POW camps. They were being processed for burial. The pit in the photograph's edge wasn't drainage excavation. It was a grave dug before the bodies existed to fill it. The shadows that prove the photograph was taken in late afternoon also prove that the grave was dug that morning, indicating premeditation, not spontaneous reprisal. Everything in the frame is evidence of calculated murder, captioned as routine administration. Hawker survived the war. He worked as a bank clerk in Hamburg from 1946 until his retirement in 1965. He kept the photograph negatives in his attic, carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves, organized by date and location. When investigators finally located him in the 1970s, he claimed not to remember the specifics of that day, though he acknowledged taking the photographs. He died in 1989, never prosecuted, never imprisoned, carrying the memory of what he'd documented without ever admitting what he'd witnessed. The photographs remain in the Bundesarchiv, properly catalogued, available to researchers, silent testimony to an afternoon when a camera recorded murder and called it processing. The pit was filled, the earth settled, the commendation was filed, and Das Reich moved forward into Russia, carrying with it the knowledge that victory could be measured in tons of ammunition expended on unarmed men. This was the division's first operational success, not a battle won, but a massacre completed and successfully disguised as legitimate warfare. The photograph proves it. The shadows don't lie. Chapter 5. The Rzhev Meat Grinder. The 14th of January, 1942, Dr. Heinrich Bucher, Divisional Medical Officer for Das Reich, sat in a converted barn that served as the main casualty clearing station, riding in a surgical log by the light of a kerosene lantern. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. His handwriting, normally controlled and precise, showed the characteristic degradation of a surgeon reaching the limits of endurance. Patient 1847, gunshot wound, lower abdomen. Patient 1848, frostbite, both feet, amputation. Patient 1849, gunshot wound, left shoulder. The entries continued in increasingly illegible script until patient 1936, where the handwriting collapsed into an unreadable scrawl. The log stopped there. Bucher's hand had cramped, the muscles in his fingers frozen into position from hours of writing in sub-zero cold. He couldn't hold the pen anymore. Das Reich had entered the Rzhev salient in mid-November 1941, as part of the Wehrmacht's attempt to hold defensive positions around Moscow after Operation Typhoon's failure. The Rzhev salient was a bulge in the German line, jutting into Soviet territory, creating a vulnerable position that Soviet forces attacked relentlessly throughout the winter. The division's initial strength was 19,021 men. By March 31st, that number had dropped to 12,450. 7,000 casualties in 4.5 months. But only 2,114 were recorded as killed in action, meaning 4,457 men had simply disappeared into categories the paperwork struggled to capture. Evacuated to field hospitals and never returned, reclassified to other units without documentation, frozen to death in positions where recovery was impossible, or, in numbers the army didn't like to admit, deserted. The Soviet counterattacks at Rzhev followed a pattern so repetitive it reads like bureaucratic insanity in the operational logs. On November 16th, Soviet forces assaulted Das Reich's positions, pushing the division back 340 meters. The division counterattacked the next day, regaining 210 meters at a cost of 112 casualties. Net loss: 130 meters and 112 men. This exchange repeated, with minor variations in numbers and locations, 17 times between November and March. Same attack plan, same defensive response, same outcome. The operational maps show the division's frontage shifting back and forth across the same snow-covered fields like a murderous pendulum, gaining nothing, losing everything. What strikes me about the Rzhev period isn't the dramatic moments, there were none, but the grinding mathematical certainty of loss. On January 2nd, the division executed its third counterattack plan of the week: advance 2 kilometers, establish a strongpoint, dig in before Soviet artillery bracketed the position. The attack began at 0600 hours. By 1400 hours, the division had advanced 1.8 kilometers and suffered 127 casualties. Soviet artillery began ranging in at 1415. By 1600 hours, the division had withdrawn to starting positions, leaving behind the wounded they couldn't evacuate and equipment too damaged to recover. Net gain: 0 kilometers. Cost: 127 men, 4 machine guns, and 2 mortars. The War Diary entry notes this as a successful spoiling attack, though what it spoiled besides German manpower isn't specified. The cold killed more efficiently than combat. On December 8th, temperatures plummeted to -38 degrees Celsius and stayed there for 48 hours. In that period, Das Reich suffered 890 frostbite casualties, more than the division had taken in combat since arriving at Rzhev. Medical returns show the breakdown: 215 cases requiring digit amputation, 432 cases of severe frostbite requiring evacuation, and 243 cases treated in field stations and returned to duty with permanent tissue damage. The German army had invaded Russia in summer uniforms, assured by logistics planners that the war would be over before winter. Winter had arrived, and the assurances proved worthless. Men wrapped their feet in newspaper and straw because winter boots hadn't been manufactured in sufficient quantities. The boots that did arrive were leather, which froze rigid in extreme cold, becoming useless or actively harmful. Bucher's requisition requests tell their own story of collapse. In December, he requested standard medical supplies, bandages, sulfa drugs, morphine in quantities appropriate for expected combat casualties. In January, his requisitions shifted, more morphine, significantly more. By February, his morphine requests had increased 340% compared to December levels, while combat casualty rates had increased only 12%. The mathematical discrepancy suggests widespread use beyond battlefield analgesia. Soldiers were self-administering morphine for psychological pain, for frostbite pain, for the grinding misery of static defense in sub-zero temperatures against an enemy whose attacks, while predictable, were unstoppable. The division attempted the same counterattack on January 22 that it had attempted on January 2 and January 12. Advance 2 kilometers, establish strongpoint, withdraw when Soviet response proved overwhelming. Divisional Command reported the January 22 attack as a successful spoiling operation that disrupted enemy preparations. Regimental logs show something different. The division advanced 1.3 kilometers in 4 hours, suffered 97 casualties, established positions, received Soviet artillery fire for 2 hours, and withdrew within 6 hours of the attack's commencement. Net gain, 0. Disruption of enemy operations, none documentable. The only thing spoiled was German offensive capability, which diminished with each repetition of this futile cycle. I'm stuck on the fact that they repeated the same attack plan 17 times. Not because it worked, it never worked, but because no one in the command structure had the imagination or authority to stop. The operational pattern suggests institutional paralysis masquerading as tactical doctrine. Attacking was something Das Reich could do, so they did it, regardless of outcome. The alternative, admitting they lacked the strength or capability to accomplish anything beyond static defense, was psychologically or politically unacceptable. So they attacked, bled, withdrew, and prepared to attack again, in an endless cycle that consumed men without producing results. By March, Bucher was requesting evacuation. His last log entry, dated March 5, is brief. "I cannot perform surgery with frostbitten fingers, requesting evacuation." The request was denied for 11 days. He remained at his post because there was no replacement available, performing amputations and debridements with hands that had lost feeling in 3 fingers. His surgical outcomes, tracked in the cold arithmetic of survival rates, deteriorated measurably in those 11 days. Men who might have survived with proper surgery died because the surgeon's hands didn't work correctly. This is Regev reduced to its essential truth. Competence degraded to inadequacy by conditions that made competence impossible. The division that left Regev in April bore little resemblance to the division that arrived in November. 7,000 casualties. Equipment losses that couldn't be tallied precisely because the chaos of static warfare made accurate inventory impossible. Morale damage that medical logs could only hint at through morphine requisition spikes and desertion rates that official reports refused to acknowledge. Das Reich had survived Regev, but survival and success weren't synonymous. They'd held the salient because withdrawal would have been admission of defeat. And admission of defeat was operationally impossible for an SS division whose entire existence was predicated on ideological superiority. So they held and bled and repeated the same failed attacks 17 times, proving nothing except that repetition doesn't make futility into victory. The surgical logs were packed into crates and shipped west with the division when redeployment orders finally came. Bucher's cramped handwriting, frozen into the pages by cold and exhaustion, remained legible enough to document what official histories preferred to omit. Regev wasn't a battle, it was a meat grinder set to slow speed, consuming men at a rate that bureaucracy could track, but command couldn't stop. The division had learned that holding ground cost blood, but not how to stop the bleeding. That lesson would come later, somewhere else, measured in different bodies and different frozen ground. Chapter 6. The Kharkov Myth. The 17th of March, 1943. Oberst Wilhelm Harp, Wehrmacht liaison officer to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, sat in a requisitioned apartment in recently retaken Kharkov, writing a letter to his wife. His handwriting showed the particular careful precision of a man choosing words that might survive military censorship. "They are already calling it a miracle," he wrote. "But I watched the Soviets leave 3 days before the SS arrived. The miracle is convincing Berlin this was combat." Harp sealed the letter, knowing his contempt for SS victory claims would remain private, or so he hoped. The letter survived in family archives, discovered decades later by researchers tracking Wehrmacht-SS relations. It provides a ground truth counter-narrative to what became the centerpiece of SS Panzer Corps propaganda, the recapture of Kharkov. Das Reich had spent January and February 1943 refitting in France, receiving equipment and personnel that transformed it on paper into an elite mechanized force. 42 Tiger I heavy tanks arrived, fresh from the factories, representing the cutting edge of German armor technology. New recruits, 14,000 of them, brought divisional strength back toward authorized levels. These recruits averaged 18.3 years old, according to personnel records. They were younger, less experienced than the men who'd frozen at Rzhev, but they had equipment the Rzhev survivors could only have dreamed of. Training period, 8 weeks. Standard Wehrmacht training, 16 weeks. The SS was still trying to compress preparation into abbreviated timelines, still believing ideological motivation could substitute for technical competence. The assault on Kharkov began on March 9, 1943, as part of Field Marshal Manstein's counterstroke following the disaster at Stalingrad. Soviet forces had overextended their winter offensive, creating vulnerable salients that German armor could exploit. Das Reich, as part of SS Panzer Corps, drove northeast toward Kharkov with orders to encircle and destroy Soviet defenders. Operational maps show the division advancing against moderate resistance, covering ground quickly, achieving objectives on schedule. The maps, however, don't show what British signals intelligence intercepted on March 6. Soviet Southwest Front headquarters ordering the 40th and 69th Armies to withdraw from Kharkov to avoid encirclement. The Soviets were leaving before Das Reich arrived. The assault on Kharkov's northern suburbs on March 12 encountered what the after-action report described as determined resistance. Medical logs from that day record 93 casualties, which sounds substantial until you examine the causes. 87 were from booby traps, mines, and building collapses in previously bombarded structures. 6 were from actual combat with rearguard Soviet forces. The Wehrmacht has a specific terminology for this kind of fighting: Nachhutgefecht, rearguard action. It's what happens when an army withdraws in good order, leaving small units to delay pursuit. It's not the same as determined defense of a city, but Das Reich's operational reports didn't use the term Nachhutgefecht. They used Strassenkampf, street fighting, which implies contested urban warfare rather than pursuit of a retreating enemy. The discrepancy in tank kill claims bothered Harp enough that he conducted his own count. SS Panzer Corps credited Das Reich with destroying 612 Soviet tanks during the Kharkov operation. Harp, using actual wreck surveys and examination of abandoned vehicles, counted 41. And most of those 41 showed no combat damage. They'd been abandoned intact, either due to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion. The difference between 612 and 41 is the difference between a legendary battlefield victory and a pursuit operation against forces already in retreat. Harp's count didn't make it into official records. The SS version did. The victory parade through Kharkov on March 15th was filmed extensively for the Wochenschau newsreels that played in German cinemas. Analysis of the footage, which I undertook frame by frame using archival copies, reveals something peculiar. The same street appears 3 times in the parade footage, filmed from different angles. The civilians cheering the German troops are wearing the same clothes in each shot, suggesting the same people filmed multiple times to create the illusion of large crowds. One woman in a distinctive headscarf appears in 3 separate, different streets. The newsreel editors were creating the impression of mass adulation through repetition and creative camera work. The actual population of Kharkov in March 1943 was starving and traumatized, not celebrating. To me, the most revealing detail about Kharkov isn't what happened, but what it cost. Das Reich expended 127 tons of ammunition during the entire operation. 127 tons sounds substantial until you compare it to Rzhev, where the division used that much in a single day of defensive fighting. The ratio of ammunition expenditure to territorial gain suggests something other than intense combat. It suggests that Kharkov was retaken because the Soviets chose to abandon it, and Das Reich filled the vacuum left by that withdrawal. The fighting that occurred was real. 93 casualties proves that. But it wasn't the epic urban struggle that post-war narratives described. The Tiger I tanks that made Das Reich so formidable on paper had a critical limitation that operational reports glossed over. Operational range of 140 kilometers. 140 kilometers on roads, less cross-country. The Maybach HL-230P45 engine consumed fuel at a rate that made sustained operations impossible without massive logistical support. Many of the destroyed Soviet tanks Das Reich claimed credit for were actually Soviet tanks that had run out of fuel during their own offensive operations in January and February. They were already wrecked or abandoned when German forces arrived. Claiming them as combat kills inflated the victory statistics without adding military substance. What fascinates me about Kharkov is how thoroughly it served ideological rather than military purposes. The SS needed a victory to rehabilitate their reputation after Stalingrad's disaster and to justify their resource consumption. Das Reich provided that victory by retaking a major city, regardless of whether that city was defended. The Wehrmacht needed proof that Manstein's counterstroke strategy could work, regardless of whether the counterstroke faced organized resistance. Both institutions got what they needed, and the actual tactical situation, Soviets withdrawing, Germans pursuing, disappeared beneath layers of propaganda and self-congratulation. The Red Army's Southwest Front commander, General Vatutin, received no censure for losing Kharkov. Soviet records, declassified after the Cold War, show the withdrawal was planned and executed to preserve forces for the defensive preparations that would become the Kursk salient. Vatutin wasn't defeated at Kharkov. He traded space for time, exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed. The Germans interpreted this as victory because occupation of a city felt like victory. The city's capture mattered more than the forces that had defended it, which escaped to fight another day. Harp's letter made it home. His widow donated his papers to a German military archive in the 1970s, where researchers discovered his unvarnished assessment of the Kharkov operation. His judgment that the miracle was convincing Berlin this was combat stands as a quiet indictment from within the Wehrmacht establishment. The regular army watched the SS celebrate their reconquest and understood what had actually happened. But understanding and acknowledgement are different things. The myth of Kharkov served too many institutional purposes to be dismantled by inconvenient facts. The victory was filed, photographed, and celebrated. Das Reich had proven itself in urban warfare, according to official narratives. They'd retaken a major Soviet city through aggressive armored maneuver and street-fighting prowess. The narrative was clean, heroic, and fundamentally dishonest. But dishonesty that serves institutional pride becomes truth through repetition. Kharkov became the SS Panzer Corps' finest hour, mentioned in every regimental history, every divisional chronicle, every veteran memoir. And in archives, in letters home, in British signal intercepts and Soviet withdrawal orders, the evidence of a different story quietly accumulated, waiting for historians willing to look past the mythology. Chapter 7. The Prokhorovka Ledger. The 11th of July, 1943. A Tiger I driver named Oscar Mueller sat in the commander's hatch of tank number 231, watching a fuel gauge that read barely above empty. The needle hovered at 180 liters, 33% of the tank's 540-liter capacity. Behind him, Positioned along the low ridge overlooking the Psel River, 14 other Tigers from Das Reich's tank battalion sat in hull-down positions, their engines idling to conserve fuel. The morning strength report had listed 15 operational Tigers out of 42 assigned to the division. 15. The rest were scattered across the Ukrainian steppe in various states of mechanical breakdown, waiting for parts that wouldn't arrive or fuel that didn't exist, or repair crews who were already overwhelmed. This was the force that would face the largest tank battle in history. The previous day's fuel requisition had been stamped "Rejected," priority diverted to Luftwaffe. The stamp was routine bureaucracy, but its implications were catastrophic. Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive against the Kursk salient, had been underway since July 5. 6 days of sustained combat had consumed fuel reserves faster than the logistics chain could replenish them. Air support took precedence over armor, a decision made at Army group level that left Das Reich's Tigers with enough fuel to fight in place, but not to maneuver. Müller's Tiger began the battle with 1/3 fuel capacity. Every Tiger in the battalion faced similar constraints. They weren't positioned on that ridge because it was tactically optimal. They were there because they couldn't afford to reposition anywhere else. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army attacked at 0830 hours on July 12. Approximately 500 tanks advanced across open ground toward Das Reich's positions. Soviet archives declassified in 1991 confirm the number: 494 tanks and self-propelled guns committed to the assault. The attack was visible from kilometers away, dust clouds rising from hundreds of T-34s churning across the steppe. A steel avalanche that Soviet planners hoped would overwhelm German positions through sheer mass. German doctrine called for mobile defense, repositioning to create killing zones, exploiting superior optics and gun range. But mobile defense requires mobility, and mobility requires fuel. Das Reich's Tigers had superior guns, superior armor, and insufficient fuel to do anything except sit in place and shoot. Between 0830 and 1100 hours, Müller's Tiger fired 6 rounds from its 88mm gun. 6 rounds. Then the turret traverse motor failed, an electrical fault, possibly heat-related, possibly from sustained vibration during sustained firing. The turret could still traverse manually, but manual traverse required 2 crew members operating hand cranks at a rate of 1 full rotation per 60 seconds. Against moving targets at combat ranges, manual traverse was effectively useless. Müller's Tiger became a stationary pillbox with a gun that couldn't track targets. The crew sat in the hull, watching Soviet tanks pass outside their effective engagement cone, unable to do anything except survive. The killing field narrative that dominates popular accounts of Prokhorovka describes German tanks methodically destroying wave after wave of Soviet armor. The narrative is partially true. German tanks fired from static positions. They had no choice, as Soviet T-34s charged across open ground. Soviet losses were severe, catastrophically severe by any measure of military effectiveness. But the German victory narrative omits the crucial detail. Most German tanks were firing from static positions, not by tactical choice, but by mechanical or logistical paralysis. Müller's Tiger wasn't defending brilliantly. It was immobilized by equipment failure and fuel shortages. German records claimed 400 Soviet tank kills at Prokhorovka. Soviet loss reports showed 235 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Both numbers represent inflated claims. Soviet commanders overcounted German tanks to excuse losses. German commanders overcounted Soviet wrecks to justify continued operations despite mounting casualties. The actual number likely fell between the two claims. What's certain from examination of post-battle wreck surveys conducted by Soviet engineers after the front stabilized is that 34 abandoned German tanks showed empty fuel tanks and no combat damage. 34. They'd been abandoned not because they were knocked out, but because they couldn't move, and German retreat left them behind. What haunts me about Müller's testimony, recorded in a 1970s oral history interview preserved in Bundesarchiv collections, is his matter-of-fact description of abandoning Tiger 231. The tank wasn't destroyed. It had suffered turret traverse motor failure and was sitting on an empty fuel tank, but the hull was intact, the engine functional, the main gun operational if manually traversed. But when Das Reich withdrew from the Prokhorovka positions late on July 12th, there was no fuel to move Tiger 231 and no recovery vehicles available to tow it. Müller and his crew destroyed the radio equipment, removed the breech block from the main gun, and walked away. The tank sat on that ridge until Soviet forces recovered it 3 days later, repairable with minimal effort, abandoned by an army that couldn't afford to save its own equipment. The fuel logistics crisis at Kursk wasn't unique to Das Reich, but Das Reich's reliance on Tigers made it particularly vulnerable. The Tiger's Maybach HL-230 engine consumed 270 liters per 100 kilometers under combat conditions, more when maneuvering cross-country. A Tiger battalion conducting sustained operations needed tanker trucks delivering fuel continuously just to maintain position. The tanker trucks were priority targets for Soviet artillery and ground attack aircraft. Every truck destroyed meant tanks immobilized. The mathematics of fuel consumption versus fuel delivery created an operational ceiling that tactics couldn't overcome. You couldn't maneuver without fuel, and fuel delivery under combat conditions was nearly impossible to sustain. The Zahnradfabrik Friedrichshafen SSG-77 gearbox installed in the Tiger had an oil cooling system designed for European conditions. Moderate temperatures, relatively clean air, maintained roads. The Ukrainian steppe in July provided none of these. Temperatures exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. Dust infiltrated every seal and filter. Cross-country movement generated constant transmission stress. When oil temperatures exceeded 110 degrees Celsius, the automatic transmission began slipping gears. Above 120 degrees, complete failure became likely. German tankers learned to monitor oil temperature as carefully as enemy positions, because mechanical failure was as dangerous as enemy fire. Das Reich Tigers averaged 4.7 kills per tank at Prokhorovka, according to after-action analysis. 4.7 Soviet tanks destroyed for every German Tiger engaged. This sounds impressive, suggests superiority, validates the Tiger's reputation as a war-winning weapon. But those same Tigers averaged 1.2 days of operational time before mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion rendered them non-combat capable. 1.2 days. You can win individual engagements with that kind of kill ratio, but you can't win campaigns when your primary weapon system requires near-constant maintenance and consumes resources you don't have. The operational reality of Prokhorovka was that Das Reich's armor fought from positions determined by logistics rather than tactics, achieved kills through superior German optics and gun performance rather than maneuver skill, and ultimately withdrew not because Soviet forces defeated them, but because they couldn't sustain operations in place. The battle was a tactical success, Soviet losses exceeded German losses, and an operational failure. The Kursk offensive, which Prokhorovka was meant to support, failed to achieve its objectives. German forces withdrew to starting positions by late July. The Soviet salient held. The strategic initiative in the east passed permanently to the Red Army. I find myself returning to Müller's detail about being ordered to defend in place because there wasn't fuel to reposition. This wasn't strategy, this was triage. German tactical doctrine emphasized fluid defense, creating killing zones through movement. But doctrine required resources, and resources didn't exist in sufficient quantities. So tactical sophistication degraded to static defense, and static defense against Soviet mass attacks meant absorbing losses without the ability to maneuver away from danger. The Wehrmacht at Kursk was trapped by its own logistical inadequacy, forced to fight the kind of battle it was least suited for because it lacked the fuel to fight any other way. Müller walked away from Tiger 231 on the evening of July 12th. The tank sat on its ridge, intact but immobile, a monument to logistical failure disguised as tactical deployment. Soviet recovery crews found it on July 15th and towed it to a collection point for damaged vehicles. The Tiger eventually ended up in a Moscow museum, displayed as a trophy of Soviet victory at Kursk. The museum placard describes it as destroyed in combat. The reality, abandoned due to fuel exhaustion and mechanical failure, isn't as dramatic, doesn't serve the narrative requirements of either German tactical excellence or Soviet martial triumph. But the reality is what the fuel logs prove. Das Reich fought Prokhorovka with one hand tied behind its back, and the hand that tied it wasn't Soviet but German, strangled by supply lines that couldn't deliver what doctrine demanded. The battle ended. The wrecks were counted or miscounted, depending on which reports you trust. Das Reich withdrew south, toward defensive positions that would become the new front line. They'd proven the Tiger was a formidable weapon when properly deployed. They'd also proven that proper deployment required resources Germany increasingly lacked. The lessons were there in the fuel requisition forms stamped "rejected", in the maintenance logs showing transmission failures, in Mueller's testimony about walking away from a functional tank because the gasoline to move it didn't exist. But lessons and institutional learning aren't the same thing. Das Reich would face the same fuel crises, the same mechanical failures, the same gap between tactical capability and logistical reality in every subsequent operation. The Tiger remained a symbol of German armored might. The fuel gauge remained on empty. Chapter 8. The September Dissolve. The 19th of September, 1943, 21:47 hours. A British signals intelligence station at Bletchley Park intercepted a German radio transmission on a frequency assigned to Das Reich headquarters, requesting orders, no contact division HQ 72 hours, ammunition Koenig, repeat. The transmission ended abruptly. The frequency went silent and remained silent for the next 8 hours. British Y service operators, who'd been tracking Das Reich's communications since the division's withdrawal from Kursk, noted the silence in their log. The intercept suggested something worse than combat losses. It suggested organizational disintegration. A military unit that can't communicate with its headquarters isn't a military unit. It's a collection of isolated groups trying to survive independently. The division had been retreating through Ukraine since early August, part of the general German withdrawal following Kursk's failure. Army Group South was conducting a fighting retreat toward the Dnieper River, attempting to establish defensive lines that could halt Soviet advances. Das Reich's role in this retreat was theoretically straightforward: provide rearguard protection, delay Soviet pursuit, maintain unit cohesion. The reality, documented in fragmentary radio intercepts and contradictory march orders, showed a different pattern. The division was dissolving, fragmenting into Kampfgruppen, battle groups, that operated semi-independently because coordinated operations had become impossible. On September 15th, near Poltava, Das Reich headquarters ordered a morning roll call to assess unit strength. 4,200 men responded. The division's nominal strength was 18,000. 4,200. The remaining 13,800 men weren't listed as casualties, weren't reported as captured, weren't documented as transferred to other units. They were simply absent from roll call. Some were scattered across hundreds of kilometers of Ukrainian countryside, in units that had lost contact with headquarters. Some were in field hospitals, their paperwork lost or unfiled. Some had deserted. And some existed only as names on personnel rosters, their actual status unknown and unknowable in the chaos of retreat. The Kampfgruppe system, which Wehrmacht doctrine used for tactical flexibility, became a symptom of collapse rather than strength. Kampfgruppe Weidinger, the remnant of the Der Führer Regiment, lost contact with Corps headquarters on September 28th and operated independently for 11 days. The Divisional War Diary shows an 11-day gap in reporting from that regiment. No situation reports, no casualty figures, no operational updates. The unit existed somewhere in Ukraine, doing something, but what they were doing and where they were doing it remained unknown to higher command. On October 9th, radio contact was re-established. Kampfgruppe Weidinger reported positions near Kirovograd, approximately 90 kilometers from where division headquarters expected them to be. British signals intelligence intercepts from early October paint a picture of organizational chaos that German official records tried to obscure. On October 8th, Y service operators logged Das Reich call signs, transmitting simultaneously from locations 190 kilometers apart. 190 kilometers. A mechanized division occupying that much frontage isn't defending, it's scattered. The intercept showed units requesting ammunition resupply using code names, Koenig for ammunition dump locations, that other units didn't recognize, suggesting the breakdown of standardized communication protocols. When units can't understand each other's supply requests because they're using different codename systems, coordination becomes impossible. The German OKH situation map for October 15th showed Das Reich concentrated near Zhytomyr, a neat blue rectangle on the map representing divisional positions. Individual regimental reports filed that same day placed units near Kiev, Kirovograd, and Berdichev. 3 different locations, none of them Zhytomyr. The map was a fiction, a comforting representation of order that didn't exist on the ground. Situation maps served institutional needs. Higher headquarters required neat lines showing where units were supposed to be. But those lines bore increasingly little relationship to messy reality. Das Reich existed on maps as a coherent division. In Ukraine, it existed as fragments. What strikes me most about this period is how many men simply vanished from documentation. On November 3rd, official divisional strength was listed as 7,401 all ranks. Since the September 15th roll call of 4,200, the division had supposedly received 3,200 replacements. But there's no record of 3,200 men being transferred in. The math doesn't work. More likely, the November strength figure represented administrative guesswork. Someone at headquarters estimated how many men the division should have and wrote that number in the report. The actual number was unknowable because the units that would provide accurate counts were scattered, out of contact, or non-existent. The division abandoned 219 vehicles during the September-October retreat, according to final equipment inventories compiled when Das Reich reached Poland. 219 vehicles marked serviceable at the time of abandonment. They weren't destroyed by combat. They were left behind because fuel didn't exist to move them, or because the units operating them had disintegrated and the vehicle sat orphaned, or because in the chaos of retreat, abandoning equipment was easier than coordinating recovery. Each abandoned vehicle represented a small logistical defeat, a moment when maintaining equipment became less important than maintaining movement. Wehrmacht radio discipline protocols, which had been drilled into communications personnel through years of training, collapsed under operational pressure. Enigma encryption required proper codebook procedures, careful message formatting, and time. Time to encode, time to transmit, time to decode. Units in contact with the enemy, retreating under pressure, didn't have time. Operators began transmitting in plain text, improvising codes that were transparent to anyone listening. Koenig supposedly meant ammunition dump, but which ammunition dump? The improvised system worked only if both sender and receiver understood the context, and context was exactly what the fragmenting division lacked. British intercept operators noted with some amazement that German units were transmitting grid coordinates in plain text, making targeting by Soviet artillery trivially easy. I note that military historians describe this period as withdrawal to defensive positions, but the radio logs read like a scavenger hunt with no map. Units requesting orders that never arrived. Headquarters issuing commands to units that had ceased to exist. Supply officers coordinating deliveries to map coordinates where no German forces remained. The organizational chart said Das Reich was a Panzer Division. The intercept showed Das Reich was a bureaucratic fiction, a name attached to scattered Kampfgruppen that shared little except their divisional insignia and their confusion. The retreat ended, theoretically, when Das Reich reached Poland in early November. Reaching Poland didn't restore cohesion. It just stopped the movement long enough for headquarters to attempt a census. Of the 12,000 men unaccounted for between September and November, 34 Das Reich officers were eventually court-martialed for loss of equipment. Not for tactical failures, not for unauthorized retreats, but for losing equipment. The bureaucracy cared more about inventory than operations, more about accountability for missing trucks than accountability for missing battalions. The trials were perfunctory. Most officers received reprimands. The equipment remained lost. What entity was rebuilt in early 1944 if the original division had ceased to exist? This is the question that haunts me when examining the reconstitution orders. Das Reich in November 1943 was a name without substance, a headquarters element controlling fragments that barely constituted a regiment, let alone a division. The rebuilding process that followed would pour new personnel and equipment into this structure, but the continuity was administrative rather than operational. The division that would fight in Normandy in June 1944 shared almost nothing with the division that had fought at Prokhorovka, except its name and its insignia. The men were different, the equipment was different, even the institutional knowledge had evaporated with the thousands who disappeared during the September dissolve. The radio frequencies fell silent as units consolidated in Poland. The British intercept stations noted the absence of Das Reich traffic, marking the division as reconstituting in their intelligence assessments. The scattered Kampfgruppen were gathered, or what remained of them was gathered. Headquarters re-established contact with its subordinate units, or with whatever subordinate units still existed. The maps were redrawn to show Das Reich as a coherent entity again, occupying a neat rectangle of Polish countryside, prepared for refitting. The maps lied, as they had lied in October, but the lies served institutional purposes. The German army needed Das Reich to exist, so on paper it existed, coherent and ready for reconstitution. The reality, thousands of men unaccounted for, hundreds of vehicles abandoned, an organizational structure that had dissolved under pressure, was too messy for official documentation. So it was simplified, rationalized, and filed away as a temporary setback rather than systemic collapse. Chapter 9. The Normandy Rehearsal. The 22nd of March, 1944, Montauban, southern France, a training field where Das Reich was attempting to transform recruits into tank crews. Recruit Schaefer, age 17, lay crushed beneath a Panther tank's left track. The accident investigation report, filed 3 hours later, documented the cause with bureaucratic precision. Unfamiliar with Panther track tension procedures, Schaefer had been guiding the tank during a loading exercise. The track, improperly tensioned, had thrown and whipped sideways, catching him before he could move clear. He died before medical personnel arrived. The investigating officer's recommendation was equally precise: extend training by 4 weeks. The response, stamped in red ink at the bottom of the page: denied, deployment timeline fixed. Schaefer was the 8th training fatality since Das Reich began reforming in January. There would be more. The division reforming in southern France bore little resemblance to the division that had dissolved in Ukraine. 14,000 new recruits arrived between January and March, filling a structure that had been hollowed out by casualties, desertions, and administrative chaos. Personnel files show 60% of these recruits were born after 1926. Too young to have served in earlier campaigns, too young to have experienced Eastern Front combat. They came from Hitler Youth organizations, from emergency conscription levies, from the shrinking pool of German manpower that hadn't already been consumed by 4 years of war. Average age, 18.3 years. Average combat experience, 0. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Krag, assigned as primary training officer, faced an impossible timeline. Standard Wehrmacht training for panzer crews required 16 weeks to achieve basic combat competence, 8 weeks of basic military skills, 8 weeks of specialized armor training. Das Reich's training cycle was compressed to 8 weeks total. 8 weeks to transform teenagers into tankers, 8 weeks to teach gunnery, driving, maintenance, radio operation, and tactical coordination. Krag's training reports, which I've examined in detail across multiple archive collections, show increasing desperation. 40% of recruits hadn't completed basic weapons qualification by the end of week 6. They were being certified combat-ready while still learning which end of a Panzerfaust to point at the enemy. The training accident rate tells its own story. On April 20th, a live-fire exercise resulted in 4 casualties from friendly fire and 1 from grenade mishandling. The friendly fire casualties occurred when an MG-42 gunner, startled by incoming fire from the opposing force, traversed his weapon through the arc where his own squad was advancing. The grenade casualty occurred when a recruit attempted to throw a stick grenade without properly understanding the time delay fuse. He held it too long. The grenade detonated in his hand. These weren't combat losses. These were the predictable results of insufficient training under time pressure. But the timeline was fixed. Deployment was scheduled for early June regardless of readiness. The SS Main Operational Office inspection on May 1st produced a report that rated Das Reich combat ready. The same day, Krag submitted an attached memorandum, not a separate report, just an attachment to the official assessment, stating the division required minimum 60 days additional training to achieve actual combat competence. His memorandum was filed and ignored. To me, the gap between official assessment and ground truth evaluation defines Das Reich's Normandy preparation. The division was combat ready if combat ready meant having the prescribed number of men and vehicles. It wasn't combat ready if combat ready meant those men and vehicles could execute doctrine under fire. By late May, Hitler Youth recruits aged 16 to 17 comprised 22% of divisional strength. 16-year-olds operating Panzerfausts after 3 hours of instruction. The Panzerfaust 60, standard German anti-tank weapon, required 12 kilograms of pull force to arm its firing mechanism. Physical testing showed teenage recruits averaged 9 kilograms of grip strength. They literally lacked the hand strength to reliably arm the weapons they'd been issued. Training attempted to compensate through technique, but technique requires practice time, and practice time didn't exist in an 8-week curriculum. The division was fielding child soldiers armed with weapons they couldn't properly operate and calling them combat ready because the bureaucracy required it. What fascinates me about the personnel composition is how it inverted normal military logic. Veteran units typically had a core of experienced soldiers who could train and integrate new recruits during lulls in combat. Das Reich in spring 1944 had almost no veterans. Most survivors of the Eastern Front campaigns had been transferred to other units during the autumn dissolution. The division was rebuilding from scratch, with inexperienced officers training inexperienced recruits, both groups learning from manuals rather than experience. It was a theater production of an elite division, actors playing roles they'd memorized without understanding the underlying reality. Krag's requisition requests tracked the training program's inadequacy through material shortages. In February, he requested standard training ammunition allotments. In March, he requested additional allocations to compensate for recruits' poor initial shooting scores. In April, he requested supplementary instruction time, which was denied. In May, he stopped requesting anything because requests were being systematically denied regardless of justification. The division consumed 1,340 tons of training ammunition between January and May, a number that sounds impressive until compared to veteran Wehrmacht divisions, which used 2,800 tons or more for comparable training periods. Das Reich was training at less than half the ammunition expenditure of units that had time to train properly. The Panther tanks that equipped Das Reich's armor battalions were mechanically sophisticated machines requiring careful maintenance and experienced crews. The Maybach HL-230 engine needed specific warm-up procedures. The transmission required precise throttle control. The fire control optics needed calibration that took skill and time. Maintenance schedules assumed trained mechanics with proper tools and spare parts. Das Reich's mechanics were as inexperienced as their combat crews, trying to maintain vehicles they barely understood with tools they'd just learned to use. The maintenance logs from April and May show a pattern of repeated failures. track adjustments performed incorrectly, requiring rework, engine tune-ups that created new problems instead of solving old ones, weapon systems taken apart for cleaning and reassembled wrong. I am struck by the cognitive dissonance between the division's reputation and its actual capability. The unit that would terrorize French civilians in June 1944 couldn't have passed a Wehrmacht readiness inspection in May. They had the equipment, Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, artillery. They had the manpower, 14,000 young men wearing SS insignia. What they lacked was competence, the accumulated knowledge that distinguishes a military formation from an armed mob. Krag knew it. His training reports document it with increasing urgency. But knowing and acknowledging are different things. The institution needed Das Reich to be ready, so Das Reich was declared ready, and the gap between declaration and reality would be paid for in French blood and German casualties. On May 28th, the division received deployment orders. Movement to Normandy would begin pending Allied invasion. The training cycle ended, ready or not, complete or incomplete. Schaefer's death, the friendly fire casualties, the grenade accident, the Panzerfaust misfires, all were categorized as acceptable training losses. The lessons learned or not learned would be tested soon enough. Krag wrote in his personal diary, discovered decades later among his effects, that he felt personally responsible for sending inadequately trained boys into combat. He'd done his best within impossible constraints, but his best hadn't been enough. The diary's final entry, dated April 1945, 1 week before his suicide, returned to that theme. I sent children to die because I couldn't find the courage to refuse. The division that moved toward Normandy in early June was an elite formation in name only. They had elite equipment, elite insignia, elite arrogance. They lacked elite training, elite discipline, elite competence. The teenagers wearing death's head collar tabs had learned enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be effective. They knew how to kill, but not how to fight. That distinction between killing and fighting would become tragically clear in the villages of southern France, where untrained soldiers with powerful weapons would prove that inadequate training plus modern firepower equals atrocity. But in late May, as the division prepared to deploy, that understanding lay ahead. For now, they were ready. The paperwork said so. Chapter 10. The Tool Rope. The 9th of June 1944, 15:44 hours. A photograph captures 3 SS soldiers from Das Reich standing beside bodies hanging from ornamental balcony railings in Toul, a market town in south-central France. The soldiers are laughing. One is smoking a cigarette. The photograph's timestamp, visible on the camera's back when the negative was later examined, reads precisely 15:44 hours. This timestamp matters because the official reprisal order, the document supposedly authorizing the hangings as response to partisan attack, was issued at 16:20 hours, 36 minutes after this photograph was taken. The documentation was retrospective justification for executions that had already begun. The photograph proves it. French resistance forces, specifically the Francs Tireurs et Partisans, had attacked the German garrison in Toul on June 7th and 8th. The attack was well planned and partially successful. 40 German soldiers killed, an ammunition depot destroyed, parts of the town held for nearly 24 hours before German reinforcements arrived. This wasn't random partisan harassment. This was organized military action by irregulars who'd been building strength since 1943. The Germans responded, as they'd responded to partisan actions across occupied Europe, with reprisal. But Toul wasn't random reprisal. The photographic evidence, the logistics records, the survivor testimony, all prove premeditation. Das Reich reconnaissance units entered Toul on the morning of June 9th. The town was already secured by garrison survivors. There was no combat on June 9th. The fighting had ended the previous evening when resistance forces withdrew to avoid encirclement. What remained were civilians, several thousand of them, going about their business in a town that had just witnessed violent combat and was now under direct SS control. Between noon and 14:30 hours, German soldiers rounded up approximately 3,000 males aged 16 to 60 in the town square. This wasn't tactical interrogation. This was mass detention. Church records from Tula, maintained by local priests even during occupation, provide names and ages. The youngest was 16. The oldest was 63. The hangings began at 1500 hours. Between 1500 and 1900 hours, 99 men were hanged from balconies, lampposts, and street fixtures across Tula's central district. 99. Not an approximate number. Survivor Aimé Dupont counted them, recorded their names, created a meticulous death list that he maintained in hiding until liberation. Dupont's list, cross-referenced with church burial records and municipal death certificates, accounts for every victim. 99 men, hanged in batches of 5 to 10, across 4 hours, in full view of civilians forced to watch from windows and doorways. The rope is the detail that destroys every defense claim. Quartermaster logs from Das Reich's supply depot show a requisition for 220 meters of rope, filed on the morning of June 8th. June 8th, before the reconnaissance units entered Toul, before any SS officer had assessed the tactical situation. Someone requisitioned hanging rope before they knew whether hangings would be necessary or appropriate. This is premeditation documented in bureaucratic minutiae. The rope didn't appear spontaneously during a heat of battle reprisal. It was ordered, issued from supply stocks, transported to Toul, and used as planned. Survivor testimony from Dupont and others provides the forensic detail that trial prosecutors would later use to reconstruct exactly what happened. The hangings used short drop technique, victims hoisted by rope around the neck without sufficient drop distance to break the neck cleanly. This produces death by strangulation rather than instantaneous cervical fracture. Strangulation takes 8 to 15 minutes. 15 minutes per victim, multiplied by 99 victims, witnessed by civilians, photographed by perpetrators. This wasn't judicial execution. This was public torture designed to terrorize. To me, the photographs are the most damning evidence because they reveal perpetrator mindset. These weren't soldiers grimly executing orders they disagreed with. These were men comfortable enough with mass murder to pose for pictures beside dying civilians. The photographs show soldiers smoking, chatting, displaying bodies to the camera like hunting trophies. One photograph shows a soldier adjusting a victim's position to improve the camera angle. These images weren't seized from reluctant perpetrators. They were taken voluntarily, kept as souvenirs, shared among units. The narcissism required to photograph your own war crimes suggests absolute certainty of impunity. 21 of the hanged men were veterans of the First World War who'd fought for France at Verdun, the Somme, the Marne. Their service records were stored in Toul's town hall, easily verifiable, decorated with citations for bravery and combat against Germany between 1914 and 1918. The SS claimed the executions targeted partisans and terrorist sympathizers. But you don't verify partisan status by checking service records, and service records for 21 victims proved they were decorated French combat veterans, not guerrillas. They were hanged because they were male, adult, and available, not because they'd participated in resistance activities. The legal justification, such as it was, came in the reprisal order issued at 1620 hours, after the executions had already begun. The order cited partisan attack resulting in German casualties and authorized reprisal measures against terrorist population. Terrorist population. That phrase, carefully vague, could mean anyone. It transforms civilians into legitimate targets through linguistic sleight of hand. But the order's timestamp betrays its purpose. It wasn't an authorization. It was documentation to create legal cover for actions already taken. This is how atrocity becomes paperwork. French investigators after liberation found multiple photographs from June 9th in abandoned German positions and in private collections seized from Das Reich veterans. Every photograph showed similar scenes: soldiers, bodies, casual poses. One series showed the progression of a single hanging, from preparation through execution to aftermath. The photographer had documented the process methodically, like recording a construction project. The banality of the documentation, its thoroughness, its matter-of-fact composition, is more disturbing than dramatic imagery would have been. This was routine work, photographed routinely. The hanging stopped at 1900 hours when available rope was exhausted and light was fading. That's the reason given in Das Reich operational logs for ending the executions: insufficient rope and approaching darkness, not military necessity or proportionate reprisal. They stopped because they ran out of rope. 99 men dead because that's how many could be hanged with 220 meters of rope in 4 hours of daylight. The mathematical precision of it, logistics determining body count, reveals the administrative nature of the massacre. This was organized murder carried out with the same procedural efficiency Germany applied to industrial production. What haunts me about Toul is the perpetrators' confidence that documentation wouldn't matter. They took photographs, knowing their actions were being recorded, knowing records could be used as evidence. They didn't care. Or, more precisely, they assumed victory would make accountability impossible. Only losers face war crimes trials, and in June 1944, Das Reich soldiers still believed Germany would win. The photographs were souvenirs of triumph, not evidence of atrocity. That assumption, that victory would erase accountability, explains the casual documentation of murder across occupied Europe. The assumption proved wrong, but only after thousands of photographs had been taken, thousands of victims had died, thousands of soldiers had posed beside bodies without concern for future consequences. 99 bodies were cut down after dark and buried in mass graves. DuPont's list preserved their names. The photographs preserved their murderers' faces. The rope requisition preserved the premeditation. And 16 kilometers away, in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, Das Reich was preparing its next operation. The pattern established at Toul, mass detention, arbitrary selection, public execution, documentary falsification, would be repeated tomorrow at larger scale. But that story requires its own accounting. For now, Toul stands as evidence that Das Reich, in June 1944, wasn't a military formation conducting counterinsurgency. It was a murder organization wearing military uniforms, documenting its crimes because it assumed documentation wouldn't matter. The photographs say otherwise. Chapter 11. Oradour-sur-Glane, the Burned Archive. The 17th of June, 1944. A French investigator named Jean-Marcel Dartout walked through ruins that still smelled of burned flesh and gasoline. Oradour-sur-Glane had been a village of approximately 650 people 1 week earlier. Now it was a necropolis, preserved in ash and silence. Dartout carried a surveyor's notebook, measuring tape, and a camera. His assignment wasn't emotional, it was forensic. The French provisional government needed documentation that would survive legal challenge, evidence that could prove what happened here beyond reasonable doubt. Dartout's field notebook, maintained with engineer's precision, would become the documentary foundation for war crimes prosecutions. His first observation, noted at 0900 hours on June 17th. Church bell bronze melted into floor. Requires sustained temperature 1084 degrees Celsius. Pews show accelerant residue. Conclusion: fire deliberately intensified. Das Reich's 3rd Company had arrived in Oradour on June 10th at approximately 1400 hours. The village population was roughly 650. Census data from March 1944 provides the baseline figure. The village wasn't a resistant stronghold, hadn't harbored partisan units, hadn't conducted operations against German forces. It was an agricultural market village distinguished primarily by its absolute ordinariness. Why Das Reich selected it remains uncertain. Some reports suggested mistaken identity, confusion with nearby Oradour-sur-Ver, which did have resistance connections. Others suggested simple proximity to Das Reich's route of march. The operational logic, if any existed, died with the commanders who gave the orders. The assembly in the marketplace began at 1430 hours. German soldiers used loudspeakers to order all inhabitants to gather for identity check. Survivor testimony describes the process as methodical, almost bureaucratic. Soldiers went house to house, compelling residents outside, checking buildings for anyone hiding. The assembled population was separated by gender. Men directed to barns and outbuildings around the village perimeter, women and children to the church. Darthout's post-war spatial reconstruction, based on survivor testimony and building measurements, shows this segregation created two distinct kill zones, separated by approximately 100 meters. The separation wasn't random, it was tactical. Men were locked in 6 barns and storage buildings. Darthout's investigation of these buildings revealed details that trial prosecutors would later use to establish premeditation. The barn doors had been barricaded from outside with wooden beams. The beams showed nail holes at specific angles, nails driven from outside, not inside, meaning the doors were deliberately sealed to prevent escape. Preserved wooden fragments showed nail angles at 15 degrees from perpendicular, proving the nails had been hammered at an angle that would make the doors impossible to force open from inside. This wasn't improvised security, this was calculated entrapment. The executions in the barns began between 1500 and 1530 hours. Ballistic analysis conducted during post-war investigations showed bullet strike patterns on barn walls concentrated at 1.2 meters above floor level. 1.2 meters is the height of a kneeling man's torso. The victims weren't standing when shot. They were forced to kneel, then machine-gunned from positions near the barn entrances. Bullet holes in preserved wall sections show overlapping impact patterns consistent with sustained automatic weapons fire into massed targets. This wasn't combat. This was execution by firing squad, scaled to industrial efficiency. The church was different. Women and children, approximately 450 people, were locked inside the 13th century stone building. Around 1530 hours, soldiers placed an incendiary device near the altar. Survivor Marguerite Rufanch, who escaped through a window, testified at post-war trials that the device produced smoke and fire that spread rapidly through the church interior. Dardaud's chemical analysis of debris, conducted in 1953 using samples preserved from the original site, showed no nitrate compounds that would indicate explosive ammunition. What the analysis did show was gasoline residue and traces of household incendiary materials, fabric soaked in accelerant. The fire was started deliberately, intensified deliberately, maintained deliberately. The physics of the church fire reveal calculated murder. Dartout's engineering analysis, based on fire propagation science, determined the roof collapse occurred at approximately 16-15 hours. Combustion of oak roof beams at that scale requires sustained temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. The church bell, cast bronze with melting point of 1084 degrees Celsius, had melted into the floor. This proves the fire burned at temperatures above 1000 Celsius, temperatures possible only with accelerants applied systematically to intensify heat. The trapped victims endured 45 minutes of increasing heat and smoke before structural collapse ended it. The fire wasn't collateral damage from combat, it was the murder weapon. Marguerite Rufanch's testimony was initially questioned because her escape seemed implausible. She claimed to have climbed through a window behind the altar, dropped approximately 3 meters to the ground, and crawled to safety while German soldiers fired at her. Dartout's measurements of the window in question showed an opening of 42 centimeters width by 68 centimeters height. Forensic reconstruction proved a human body could fit through that gap if motivated by survival panic. The window's position, behind the altar, partially obscured by decorative stonework, explained why soldiers outside might not have immediately seen her escape attempt. Ballistic analysis of the exterior wall showed bullet strikes consistent with shots fired at someone moving along the church's rear wall. Rufanch had been telling the truth. Her improbable survival was documented in architecture and ballistics. 642 people died at Orador. 247 were children under 14 years old, identified through dental records cross-referenced with school attendance logs maintained by the village teacher. The precision of the death toll reflects Dartout's meticulous investigation, matching dental remains to medical records, comparing skull measurements to family photographs, using every available forensic technique to give names to the bodies. This wasn't mass anonymous death. This was documented murder of specific individuals whose identities were preserved despite deliberate German attempts at evidence destruction. What strikes me about the evidence is how thoroughly it proves premeditation. The barn doors nailed shut from outside, the gasoline accelerants in the church, the synchronized timing of executions in multiple locations, the complete absence of German casualties, proving this wasn't combat gone wrong. Every detail shows this was planned, executed according to plan, and documented in the physical evidence that survived German attempts to destroy it. The German defense claim, ammunition depot exploded accidentally, collapsed under chemical analysis showing no military explosives. The claim was invention, contradicted by material fact. I am forced to confront that the spatial evidence shows this was choreographed. Men killed first with machine guns for efficiency. Then women and children burned for evidence destruction. The sequence reveals calculation. Dead bodies in barns could be buried, concealing cause of death. Burned bodies in a destroyed church could potentially be attributed to accident or combat. The plan almost worked. Only Dartou's engineering precision, Roufanch's survival, and the physical properties of bronze melting points exposed the truth that documentation tried to hide. The village remained in ruins, preserved by French government decision as memorial and evidence. Dartou's measurements, his chemical analyses, his photographic documentation, all entered the historical record as legal exhibits. His field notebook, with its precise engineer's handwriting, noting temperature requirements for bronze melting and gasoline residue and church debris, proved more powerful than any emotional testimony. The facts spoke. 642 dead, 247 children, doors nailed shut, gasoline accelerants, calculated murder disguised as reprisal. The notebook didn't argue, it measured, documented, and preserved. That was enough. Chapter 12. The Normandy Collapse. The 3rd of July, 1944, near Vire, in Normandy's hedgerow country, a Feld gendarmerie log recorded at 1300 hours detained 14 Das Reich soldiers, no unit insignia, heading east. Claims separated during combat. No combat in sector for 48 hours. Remanded to penal battalion. The military police, Feld gendarme, were Wehrmacht, not SS, which made their assessment brutally frank. These weren't soldiers separated by combat chaos. These were deserters fleeing toward Germany, caught by rear area patrols before they could disappear into the occupation zone. 14 men in a single patrol stop. The Feld gendarmerie logs from July show similar stops every few days. Groups of 2 to 8 Das Reich soldiers, always heading east, always claiming combat separation, always detained during periods when no combat was occurring in their supposed operational area. Das Reich had taken 21 days to move 200 kilometers from southern France to the Normandy front. 21 days for a mechanized division that should have covered that distance in 3 to 4 days maximum. The delay was partially attributable to Allied air attacks. Yabos, fighter bombers, turned French roads into killing zones during daylight hours. But movement logs show another factor: mass desertion during movement. Companies that began the march with 130 men arrived with 90. Platoons vanished entirely, their status listed as detached or separated in ways that suggested they'd simply walked away when supervision lapsed. The division was hemorrhaging personnel before it reached combat. The first major engagement came on July 2nd at Hill 112, a tactically insignificant elevation that British and German forces fought over with intensity disproportionate to its strategic value. Das Reich participated in the defense, committing approximately 2 battalions to hold German positions against British armor and infantry attacks. In 6 hours of combat, the division suffered 630 casualties and gained 0 meters of ground. The British didn't break through, but Das Reich didn't hold. They absorbed losses defending terrain they'd end up abandoning 2 days later, when the broader tactical situation made the position untenable. 630 casualties for temporary possession of a hill nobody would remember. British signals intelligence, specifically ultra-decrypts of German communications, provides a perspective German records obscured. On July 11th, British intercept operators recorded a Das Reich transmission refusing Corps orders to counterattack at Villers-Bocage. Refusing. An entire company had surrendered intact rather than execute the attack order. This wasn't combat defeat. This was mutiny disguised as surrender. German doctrine absolutely prohibited unit surrender while combat capable. Yet here was a complete company deciding that British captivity was preferable to continued fighting. The decrypt entered British intelligence summaries as evidence of declining German morale. It also proved that Das Reich's legendary fighting spirit, so celebrated in SS propaganda, had limits. The gap between what divisional command reported and what subordinate units experienced widened throughout July. On July 28, the division commander reported to Army Group B that Das Reich was conducting stubborn defense of assigned sectors. That same day, multiple regimental logs show units retreating without orders, abandoning positions when Allied pressure exceeded their willingness to resist. Army Group B logs noted with frustration that Das Reich was withdrawing from positions that higher command considered defensible. The frustration revealed command's disconnect from ground truth. Positions that looked defensible on maps were death traps to soldiers experiencing Allied artillery and air superiority. By mid-August, Das Reich was trapped in the Falaise pocket with the remnants of Army Group B, encircled by Allied forces closing from north and south. The pocket was approximately 40 kilometers across at its widest, shrinking daily as Allied armor tightened the noose. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were trapped, including Das Reich's remaining strength of approximately 15,000 men. Escape required forcing through Allied lines before the pocket closed completely. The division attempted breakout on August 20th, joining the desperate rush eastward through the narrow gap still open near Chambois. Of 15,000 men who entered the pocket, approximately 4,500 escaped. 10,500 casualties or missing, a 70% loss rate in a single operation. The arithmetic of that loss reveals something other than combat attrition. Das Reich lost 71% of its armor not to enemy fire, but to abandonment. Tank crews simply fled on foot when fuel ran out, or mechanical problems immobilized their vehicles. Panthers and Tigers worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks were abandoned intact because their crews prioritized survival over salvage. Maintenance logs show multiple tanks listed as destroyed that were actually intact but immobile, destroyed by crew using demolition charges or grenades to prevent Allied capture. Each abandoned tank represented a small failure of discipline, multiplied across the division until organizational cohesion collapsed into individual survival calculations. What fascinates me about the Normandy campaign is the bitter irony. The division that murdered civilians to maintain order at Toul and Oradour couldn't maintain its own discipline under military pressure. The soldiers who'd hanged 99 men for partisan resistance deserted their own positions when facing professional armies. The institutional ruthlessness that enabled atrocity proved useless for military effectiveness. Terrorizing French villagers didn't prepare Das Reich for combat against British and American forces with overwhelming material superiority. The division had learned to kill helpless civilians. They hadn't learned to fight. Feldgendarmerie straggler reports from July and August show 340 Das Reich soldiers detained with forged papers claiming Wehrmacht unit transfers. 340. They were fleeing SS affiliation, attempting to disappear into regular army units where their service might be less scrutinized. The forgeries were often crude, wrong unit designations, incorrect authentication stamps, but the attempt reveals desperation. These soldiers understood that SS membership after Normandy meant either death in combat or eventual prosecution for war crimes. So they forged transfer papers and hoped military police wouldn't look too closely. Most were caught. The Feldgendarmerie had experience identifying forged documentation, and SS soldiers transferring to Wehrmacht units without proper orders were automatically suspect. I note the pattern. Das Reich entered Normandy terrorizing civilians, fought poorly against actual military opposition, and disintegrated under pressure that better-trained units withstood. The teenage recruits given 8 weeks of training proved incapable of sustained combat against professional enemies. The veterans, the few who remained from Eastern Front service, were too scattered through the formation to provide institutional steadiness. The division that German propaganda celebrated as elite was exposed as a poorly trained, inadequately led, morally bankrupt organization that could murder successfully but couldn't fight effectively. By September 1st, Das Reich had been withdrawn from Normandy and was reconstituting, again, in Germany. The division that had entered France with approximately 15,000 men left with fewer than 4,000. The difference wasn't just killed in action. It was wounded, captured, missing, and deserted. The institutional cohesion that holds military formations together had evaporated under the combined pressure of Allied material superiority and internal moral bankruptcy. You can terrorize civilians into submission, but you can't terrorize Allied armies, and Das Reich learned the distinction too late to matter. The Feldgendarmerie logs were filed with other military police reports, documenting the slow-motion collapse of German military discipline in France. 14 soldiers detained. 23 soldiers detained. 8 soldiers detained. The numbers accumulated, small evidence of institutional failure, preserved in bureaucratic documentation that nobody wanted to acknowledge but couldn't completely hide. The deserters knew what their comrades had done in French villages. Some fled to escape justice. Others fled to escape association with crimes they hadn't personally committed, but knew would taint everyone who wore the division's insignia. Either way, they fled, and their flight proved that even the perpetrators understood Oradour was murder, not war. Chapter 13. The Budapest Mirage. The 18th of January, 1945. A regimental commander named Otto Kuhm sat in a frozen cellar near Bitska, hungry, writing in his war diary by the light of a single candle. The temperature outside was -15 degrees Celsius. Inside the cellar, his breath condensed into fog with each exhalation. The diary entry was brief, almost surreal in its self-awareness. Third order to attack Soviet positions at Bitska. Same route, same objective as January 12th and January 15th. Expected result, same. Question to self, why do I obey? Answer, habit. Kuhm closed the diary, put on his coat, and went to issue attack orders he knew would fail. He'd done it before. He'd do it again. The machinery of obedience ran on momentum, not logic. Operation Conrad I had begun on New Year's Day, 1945. Das Reich attacked toward Budapest with 11,000 men and 32 operational Panther tanks, respectable strength for a division that had been shattered in Normandy 4 months earlier. The mission was explicit: relieve the Budapest garrison, encircled by Soviet forces since late December. The distance from starting positions to Budapest was approximately 60 kilometers. Das Reich attacked along the same axis Wehrmacht forces had used in failed relief attempts during December. Same roads, same terrain, same Soviet defensive positions. The attack gained 26 kilometers in 6 days before Soviet counterattacks stopped it. Cost: 2,100 casualties and 14 Panthers lost to combat and mechanical failure. Net result: the division sat 26 kilometers closer to Budapest than when they'd started, still 34 kilometers short of the city. On January 7th, the attack halted, not because orders changed, but because the division couldn't advance further without replacements and resupply that weren't coming. Strength had dropped from 11,000 to 8,900 in 1 week. The division needed time to consolidate, to absorb stragglers, to repair damaged equipment. Instead, they received new attack orders, Conrad II, scheduled to begin January 12. Different route, same objective. The operational plan assumed that shifting the axis of attack would achieve results the previous axis hadn't. The assumption ignored the fundamental problem. Soviet defenses were prepared, German forces were depleted, and the arithmetic of attrition favored the side with more resources. Conrad II launched on schedule. Das Reich attacked northeast toward Budapest, gaining 18 kilometers before Soviet artillery and armor stopped the advance. Casualties: 940 men, 7 Panthers. The division now sat 18 kilometers from its Conrad II start line, still 45 kilometers from Budapest. Simple mathematics showed the problem. 2 major attacks, 44 kilometers total advance, 3,000 casualties, 21 tanks lost. At that rate, reaching Budapest would cost the entire division and still might not succeed. But arithmetic wasn't directing strategy. Hitler's directives were, and Hitler's directives didn't acknowledge resource limitations or mathematical impossibilities. The orders for Conrad III arrived on January 17th.
Com read them in his frozen cellar and recognized immediately they were verbatim copies of the Conrad II operation order with dates changed.
Same route, same objectives, same tactical scheme. He compared the documents side by side. I've done the same comparison using captured German records at the National Archives, and the only differences were date stamps and unit designations adjusted for current strength. Whoever drafted Conrad III hadn't even bothered to pretend this was new planning. They'd copied January 12th's plan, changed the dates, and transmitted it as January 18th solution. The attack began on January 18th. Das Reich gained 11 kilometers in 3 days, lost 820 casualties, destroyed 5 more Panthers. They reached positions approximately 48 kilometers from Budapest, 3 kilometers closer than they'd been on January 1st before Conrad operations began. 3 kilometers. In 18 days of sustained offensive operations, Das Reich had achieved a net advance of 3 kilometers toward an objective that was functionally unreachable. The casualty list exceeded 4,000 men. The tank strength was down to 11 operational Panthers from the original 32. And Budapest's garrison, the soldiers they were supposedly relieving, had been negotiating surrender with Soviet forces since January 28. British signals intelligence intercepted Soviet radio traffic on January 30th, showing Budapest garrison commanders discussing capitulation terms. The intercept was shared with Allied intelligence services as evidence of German strategic collapse. What it proved to me, examining the timeline, was that Das Reich's relief attempts had been operationally meaningless even before they failed. The garrison was surrendering while relief forces bled themselves fighting toward a city that wouldn't exist as a German position by the time any relief arrived. Hitler's directive claimed the relief was essential to hold the Danube, but the Danube was already lost. The attacks continued because stopping them required acknowledging failure, and acknowledging failure was politically impossible. The mathematical certainty of this futility is what haunts Kuhm's diary. He understood the attacks would fail. He wrote it explicitly. Expected result, same. Yet he obeyed. He issued orders, committed soldiers to operations he knew were suicidal, and documented his own complicity in prose that reads like confession. Why do I obey? Answer: habit. This is institutional dysfunction distilled to a single sentence. Obedience had become reflexive, disconnected from tactical logic or strategic purpose. The machinery of military hierarchy continued functioning even when it produced nothing except corpses. By February 12th, Das Reich had expended 4,200 tons of ammunition in 6 weeks of offensive operations. 4,200 tons. The divisions advanced during that same period, 0 kilometers. They'd ended February in positions 45 kilometers from Budapest, the same distance they'd been on January 1st. Casualties had reduced divisional strength to approximately 6,200 men. Tank strength: 9 operational Panthers. The operation had consumed 6 weeks, 4,000 casualties, 23 tanks, and 4,000 tons of ammunition to achieve precisely nothing. This wasn't warfare. This was human sacrifice to institutional delusion. Soviet defensive doctrine at Budapest, which I've studied through post-war Soviet military analyses, was called pack front, anti-tank gun wall. Soviet forces positioned anti-tank guns in depth, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned German attack routes into kill zones. German armor advancing into pack front defenses encountered guns firing from pre-sighted positions, meaning Soviet gunners knew exact ranges and didn't need to adjust fire. First-round hits were probable, not lucky. German attacks into these defenses guaranteed heavy losses, regardless of tactical skill or troop quality. The Soviets didn't need to outfight Das Reich. They just needed to let the division attack itself to death against prepared positions. What disturbs me about Kümm's self-awareness is the distinction between understanding and action. He knew the attacks were suicidal. He documented that knowledge in his personal diary. Yet he framed continued obedience as professionalism, as if executing hopeless orders was somehow different from causing needless deaths. The distinction is meaningless. Understanding that orders are futile while executing them anyway doesn't create moral distance from the consequences. It just proves that intelligent men can commit stupidity when institutional loyalty outweighs rational judgment. Kümm survived the war and published memoirs in 1978 that presented Budapest as a heroic defensive battle against overwhelming Soviet forces. The memoirs described stubborn resistance and tactical withdrawals without mentioning the repetitive failed attacks or the diary entries showing his recognition that the operations were pointless. When researchers later compared his published memoir to his war diary, the diary wasn't public until archival release in the 1990s. The differences revealed deliberate self-mythologizing. He'd edited his own history, removing the parts where he admitted futility and replacing them with conventional narratives of military professionalism under difficult circumstances. The comparison between published memoir and archival diary shows how post-war narratives get constructed. Kümm, the memoirist, described himself as a competent officer executing difficult missions. Kümm, the diarist, described himself as a man trapped by habit, obeying orders he knew were suicidal because disobedience was psychologically impossible. The diarist's version is more honest, more damning, and completely absent from the public record until decades after his death. History as published memoir is sanitized. History as diary entry is confession. By March, Das Reich had been withdrawn from Budapest operations and moved to defensive positions in Austria. The relief attempts had failed comprehensively. Budapest fell to Soviet forces on February 13th. The garrison Kümm had been trying to relieve had surrendered 2 weeks earlier. Every casualty Das Reich suffered after January 28th had been inflicted in service of an objective that had already ceased to exist. They'd attacked to relieve a garrison that was already negotiating capitulation. The operations weren't just futile, they were necrophiliac, fighting for a corpse. The division that left Hungary carried Kümm's diary, packed in his personal effects, documenting a commander's complicity in institutional insanity. The diary entries would remain private for decades, hidden behind the public persona of a decorated SS officer who'd done his duty under difficult circumstances. But the diary survived, preserved through archival accident, waiting for researchers who'd compare published narratives to private documentation and discover the gap between what veterans said publicly and what they knew privately. That gap is where truth lives, in the difference between the story told and the story recorded when nobody was supposed to be watching. Chapter 14. The Vienna Last Stand. The 10th of April, 1945. A Soviet combat cameraman named Lieutenant Yevgeny Khalday stood in the Floridsdorf sector of Vienna, filming what would become historically significant footage. His shot log, maintained in a field notebook now preserved in Russian state film archives, documented each scene with technical precision. Footage 1422 to 1435. Floridsdorf sector. SS troops, Das Reich insignia visible. Directing Volkssturm youth, age approximately 14 to 15, carrying Panzerfausts. Youth appeared confused. SS NCO slaps one boy, captured at 1429. Usable for propaganda? Yes. The footage Khalday captured that afternoon showed the visual collapse of German military organization. Professional soldiers using child civilians as expendable anti-tank weapons, documented in grainy black and white film that survived to become courtroom evidence. Das Reich had been redeployed to Vienna on March 16th with approximately 6,700 men, 40% of authorized divisional strength. The deployment wasn't reinforcement, it was triage. Vienna was surrounded, its fall inevitable, but symbolic importance demanded it be defended. Das Reich and other SS formations were committed to a defense that military logic said couldn't succeed, but political logic said couldn't be abandoned. The division's mission was to hold Danube river bridges long enough to allow organized evacuation of German forces from the city. Hold, then withdraw. Simple operationally, impossible practically. Soviet Third Ukrainian Front attacked Vienna on April 6 with overwhelming force, artillery, armor, infantry in numbers that German defenders couldn't match. Das Reich was assigned bridge defense in the Floridsdorf district, northern Vienna, where Danube crossings provided routes for German withdrawal or Soviet advance, depending on who controlled them. The division deployed its remaining armor, 9 operational tanks, down from dozens in previous operations, to defensive positions covering the bridges. 9 tanks to defend crossing points against Soviet tank armies. The disproportion was so severe it transcended tactical discussion. This was symbolic defense, not military defense. By April 9th, when Calde filmed his Floridsdorf footage, Das Reich had been reinforced by Volkssturm units, the People's Militia, German civilians conscripted for last-ditch defense. Volkssturm composition in Vienna included teenage boys, elderly men, and anyone else who could theoretically operate a weapon. The boys Calde filmed were 14, 15, maybe 16 years old. They'd been issued Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons requiring minimal training but exposing operators to extreme danger, and told to defend against Soviet armor. Their confusion, captured in Calde's footage, wasn't fear of combat. It was incomprehension at what was being demanded of them. The slap Calde filmed at 1429 is historically significant for what it reveals about SS methods. The boy being slapped hadn't refused orders or shown cowardice. He'd asked a question, probably about how to aim the Panzerfaust properly. The SS NCO's response, violence instead of instruction, showed an organization that had replaced training with intimidation. You terrorize children into combat instead of teaching them to fight. The slap took 3 seconds. Calde captured it because he recognized it as visual proof of regime collapse. Professional soldiers reduced to beating child soldiers into suicidal defensive positions. Soviet after-action reports from Vienna operations noted that 60% of Panzerfausts fired by Volkssturm personnel either misfired or hit friendly positions due to improper aiming. 60%. The Panzerfaust design was intentionally simple. Point tube at target, pull trigger, shape charge destroys tank. But simple still required understanding range estimation, leading moving targets, and basic ballistics. Teenage boys with zero training couldn't reliably execute those requirements. They fired at Soviet tanks from incorrect ranges, leading to premature detonations or misses. Some fired at targets already destroyed, wasting ammunition. Some froze and didn't fire at all. The 6-week training Das Reich recruits had received in 1944 would have been luxurious compared to what Volkssturm received. Often less than 4 hours of instruction before commitment to combat. German command claimed Vienna's defense was a fighting withdrawal. Organized resistance covering systematic evacuation. Soviet operational maps show something different. Das Reich positions weren't assaulted, they were bypassed. Soviet forces identified defended strongpoints, marked them on maps, and simply went around them. Floridsdorf bridges that Das Reich was supposedly defending were crossed by Soviet forces at undefended points upstream and downstream. By April 11th, Das Reich was holding positions that had no tactical value because Soviet forces were already across the Danube elsewhere. The division was defending bridges the Soviets didn't need to capture. On April 13th, Das Reich abandoned Vienna. Final headcount, approximately 3,400 men from 6,700 deployed 3 weeks earlier. 3,300 casualties or missing in 3 weeks of urban combat. The division retreated west toward remaining German-held territory, leaving behind equipment they couldn't carry and wounded they couldn't evacuate. Tanks were destroyed in place, demolition charges or grenades used to render them inoperable. The division that had entered Vienna with 9 operational tanks left with 0. Every single one had been destroyed, abandoned, or captured. What strikes me about Calday's footage is its banality. The slap isn't dramatic. The boys don't look heroic or even particularly frightened. They look confused, which is the appropriate response to being handed anti-tank weapons with minimal instruction and told to stop Soviet armor. The SS NCO doesn't look like a monster. He looks like an NCO doing his job, which happened to involve beating children into combat. The ordinariness of the evil is what makes the footage unbearable. This was routine, standard procedure, business as usual in the final collapse of an ideological regime that had weaponized its own population. The footage was suppressed in the USSR until the 1980s because it showed Red Army soldiers looting in the background of several shots. Soviet propaganda preferred clean narratives of liberation, not complicated realities showing Soviet forces pillaging even while fighting continued. But suppression didn't destroy the footage. It sat in archives, waiting for political conditions that would permit its release. When researchers finally accessed it decades later, they found Calday's shot logs attached, providing context and timestamp data that transformed propaganda footage into documentary evidence. Volkssturm casualty figures from Vienna remain imprecise because Volkssturm personnel weren't formally part of military structure. They were civilians given weapons, not soldiers with service records. When they died, their deaths weren't tracked in military casualty reports. Post-war Austrian civilian death records show spikes in male deaths aged 14 to 60 during April 1945. But cause of death was often listed as war-related without specifics. Best estimates suggest several thousand Volkssturm casualties in Vienna, but several thousand isn't precision. It's acknowledgement that the regime consumed its own children and didn't bother counting the cost. I find Calday's footage unbearable not for violence, but for banality. The slap, the confusion, the visual proof that ideology had consumed its children, all captured in 30 seconds of film stock. The footage doesn't argue, it shows. A boy being slapped for asking questions. An NCO too busy to teach because terrorizing is faster. A regime in collapse, using children as ammunition against an enemy it can't defeat. The footage is evidence that speaks without narration, proof that needs no interpretation. This happened. Camera recorded it. Archive preserved it. History must confront it. Das Reich's remnants left Vienna heading west, toward American lines, hoping to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviets. The division that had terrorized Soviet civilians knew what Soviet captivity meant. They'd created the conditions of their own fear. Every atrocity committed in Russia was a reason to avoid Soviet capture. So they fled west, abandoning Vienna, abandoning the Volkssturm children they'd slapped into combat, abandoning any pretense of military purpose beyond survival. The war was ending. Das Reich was evaporating. And somewhere in Austrian countryside, Volkssturm boys who'd survived Vienna went home, carrying Panzerfausts they'd never learned to use properly, witnesses to the final absurdity of a regime that had killed its own future. Chapter 15. The Defection Logs. The 8th of May, 1945. Camp Marcus Ohr, a U.S. Army prisoner of war processing facility in Bavaria. Captain Howard Becker of the Counterintelligence Corps sat across a wooden table from a German prisoner who'd identified himself as Wehrmacht, 116th Panzer Division. The prisoner was 23 years old, gaunt from malnutrition, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform that fit poorly. Becker's interrogation transcript records the exchange with bureaucratic precision. Q. Your unit? A. Wehrmacht, 116th Panzer. Q. Becker's handwritten note. Tattoo visible. SS blood type. Lying. Let me see your left arm. The prisoner hesitated, extended his left arm. Becker pulled back the sleeve, revealing a small tattoo under the left armpit. Blood type A positive. Standard SS identification marking. The transcript continues. Prisoner recanted. Actual unit. 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Between April 20th and May 7th, as German forces in southern Germany surrendered to advancing American units, approximately 2,890 Das Reich personnel were processed through U.S. POW camps. Initial interrogations revealed a pattern that troubled CIC investigators. 78% claimed Wehrmacht service, not SS. 2,254 prisoners claiming to be regular army, when their tattoos, dental records, and personnel documentation proved SS affiliation. This wasn't random confusion. This was organized deception. Das Reich soldiers were systematically denying SS membership, hoping to avoid war crime scrutiny by pretending they'd served in conventional units. The SS blood type tattoo, located on the left underarm approximately 8 centimeters below the armpit, was indelible ink inserted 2 to 3 millimeters deep into skin. Removal was theoretically possible through excision surgery, but excision left distinctive scarring, a small oval scar where tattoo had been. Becker and other CIC interrogators learned to check for both tattoo presence and tattoo removal scars. They also learned to use ultraviolet light, which made ink residue visible even after incomplete removal attempts. The tattoos were forensic markers that couldn't be completely erased, making SS denial difficult, but not impossible for prisoners who'd never received the tattoo, or had managed complete surgical removal before capture. On May 18th, Becker's investigation identified 34 Orador participants through cross-referencing tattoo verification, dental record matches, and personnel file analysis. 34 men who'd been present in Das Reich's 3rd Company during June 1944, now sitting in POW camps claiming Wehrmacht service and ignorance of any atrocities. Becker's investigation report, filed with CIC headquarters, noted dryly, "Subject claims ignorance of atrocities despite documented presence. Recommend war crimes investigation." The recommendation triggered formal proceedings, but formal proceedings required evidence beyond presence, specific actions, eyewitness testimony, documentary proof of individual participation. Many of the 34 would eventually be released for lack of specific evidence linking them to specific crimes. One prisoner's case reveals the pattern. Karl Heinz, age 26, claimed forced conscription into the SS in 1943. His story was plausible. Many late-war SS recruits had been conscripted rather than volunteering. But his personnel file, recovered from captured German records, showed a 1942 volunteer application with enthusiastic recommendation from local Nazi Party officials. The file included a photograph of Heinz in party uniform at a pre-war rally. His claimed narrative, unwilling conscript forced into SS against his will, contradicted documentary evidence showing eager Nazi volunteer. Confronted with the file, Heinz maintained his story, arguing the documents were forged or mistaken. The interrogators note, "Subject lying, evidence conclusive, subject persists anyway." The scale of denial was systematic enough to suggest coordination. CIC investigators discovered that Das Reich officers had distributed pre-written legend stories in April 1945, false biographies designed to create consistent cover narratives. The legends included plausible unit assignments, dates of service, locations of deployment, even names of fictitious commanders. Prisoners who'd memorized these legends could maintain consistent stories under interrogation, unless confronted with documentary evidence proving the legend false. The organized nature of the deception proved Das Reich leadership understood they'd committed crimes requiring post-war concealment. Of 2,890 Das Reich POWs initially processed, only 12 admitted SS service voluntarily. 12. That's a denial rate of 99.6%. Even accounting for genuine confusion, paperwork errors, and prisoners from attached units who weren't technically SS, the denial rate proves institutional strategy. Deny, deceive, and hope American interrogators lack the documentation to prove otherwise. The strategy worked for many prisoners. American POW processing was overwhelmed by volume, hundreds of thousands of prisoners requiring interrogation, classification, and disposition. Thorough investigation of every prisoner's claims was impossible. Many Das Reich soldiers successfully disappeared into Wehrmacht prisoner populations and were released after cursory processing.
The audacity of the deception strategy is what strikes me most. Men who'd photographed themselves at Toul hangings now claimed they were truck drivers who'd seen nothing. Officers who'd signed operational orders for Oradour claimed they'd been on leave during June 1944. Soldiers documented as present during Eastern Front atrocities claimed they'd served exclusively in France, or exclusively in Russia, or exclusively in garrison duty. Whatever story seemed least incriminating. The lies weren't sophisticated, they were brazen, betting that American investigators lacked time, resources, or motivation to verify every claim thoroughly. Becker's summary report, filed May 30, 1945, captured his frustration in language that military reports usually avoided. Prisoners demonstrate remarkable consistency in denying verifiable facts. Pattern suggests organized deception rather than individual confusion. Majority of subjects refuse to acknowledge SS service despite tattoo evidence, documentary proof, and eyewitness identification. Recommend all prisoners claiming Wehrmacht service be subject to enhanced screening, including UV tattoo examination and personnel file verification. The recommendation was implemented, but implementation didn't solve the fundamental problem. There were too many prisoners and too few investigators, and the war crimes investigation infrastructure didn't exist yet in any systematic form. The technical challenge of proving individual guilt became apparent during interrogations. Proving someone was present at Oradour was relatively straightforward. Unit rosters, personnel records, eyewitness identification. Proving they'd personally participated in specific murders was harder. The barn shootings involved dozens of soldiers firing simultaneously into massed victims. Which specific soldier killed which specific victim? The church burning involved setting fires and blocking exits. Which soldier did which action? Without specific testimony linking individuals to specific acts, prosecutors faced collective guilt arguments. Yes, the unit committed atrocity, but this particular soldier claims he wasn't personally involved, and absent specific proof, he walks. What I find most disturbing about the interrogation transcripts is the moral inversion they reveal. Perpetrators claimed victimhood, forced conscription, following orders, no choice, didn't know, wasn't there. Actual victims were dead and couldn't testify. The people being questioned were the ones who'd committed atrocities, and they were using interrogation as opportunity to craft exculpatory narratives. The process required giving perpetrators a platform to lie, then trying to disprove lies with documents the perpetrators knew had largely been destroyed during Germany's collapse. The burden of proof favored the guilty. By June 1945, CIC had identified approximately 100 Das Reich personnel as probable war crime suspects requiring further investigation. 100 out of 2,890 prisoners processed, roughly 3.5%. The other 96.5% were released to general POW populations, many with their false identities intact, their SS service unacknowledged, their participation in atrocities unexamined. They'd lied successfully, or lied well enough that proving otherwise required resources American authorities didn't have. The denial had worked. The interrogation logs were filed with other CIC reports, preserved through institutional accident rather than intention. They document a moment when perpetrators and investigators faced each other across wooden tables, one side trying to establish truth, the other side trying to escape it. The logs show questions asked, answers given, evidence presented, denials maintained. They're records of institutional failure, the failure to hold individuals accountable when accountability required more time, more investigators, and more documentation than existed. Some perpetrators were identified, most weren't. The logs preserve the names of both groups, the caught and the escaped. Chapter 16. The Trial That Wasn't. The 11th of February, 1953. A military tribunal courtroom in Bordeaux, France, where 65 defendants faced charges related to the Toul and Oradour massacres.
Presiding Judge Pierre Nussy Saint-Saul sat at the bench, listening to prosecution present evidence, photographs, survivor testimony, forensic analysis from Jean-Marcel Darthout, ammunition expenditure records, burial logs. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, damning. Nussy Saint-Saul maintained judicial demeanor during proceedings, but his private diary, donated to French National Archives in 1998 by his widow, revealed what the judge couldn't say publicly. Prosecution presented irrefutable evidence, photos, survivor testimony, burn forensics. Defense response, following orders. Jury deliberates 4 hours. Verdict, guilty. Sentence, 10 to 12 years. They'll serve 3. Justice? Non. Theater. The trial had opened January 12th with 21 Das Reich officers and 44 enlisted men in the dock. The charges were specific: murder of 642 civilians at Oradour, murder of 99 civilians at Toul, destruction of property, violations of laws of war. Each defendant faced potential death penalty if convicted. The prosecution case was methodical, building from survivor testimony through forensic evidence to documentary proof. Marguerite Ruffanche testified about the church burning. Aimé Dupont testified about the Toul hangings. Darthout testified about burn patterns and ballistics. The case was designed to be legally unassailable, meeting every evidentiary standard. The defense strategy was simple: superior orders. Every defendant claimed they'd been following commands from superiors who were dead, missing, or beyond French jurisdiction. The legal principle seemed straightforward. Nuremberg precedent established in 1946 had rejected following orders as valid defense for war crimes. But Nuremberg was international law applied by victorious powers to defeated Germany. Bordeaux was French law applied by French courts to French and German defendants. The legal framework was different, and the political context was even more different. On February 11th, verdicts were announced. 21 death sentences, 23 prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. The courtroom erupted, survivors demanding harsher sentences, defense attorneys protesting excessive punishment, jury members weeping from emotional strain. Nussy Saint-Saul gavelled for order and read the verdicts with judicial formality, knowing what his diary would record that evening. The verdicts were symbolic. The sentences wouldn't be fully executed. Justice was theatrical rather than substantive. The political context that Nussy Saint-Saul understood but couldn't publicly acknowledge was Cold War expediency. France needed West German cooperation against Soviet threat. West Germany was being rearmed as NATO ally. Executing German nationals for wartime crimes would complicate Franco-German relations at a moment when relations needed to be uncomplicated. Diplomatic cables between French Foreign Ministry and Justice Ministry, declassified in the 1990s, show explicit pressure on courts to minimize sentences despite conviction. One cable, dated February 8th, 3 days before verdicts, stated baldly, "Maintain appearance of justice without damaging alliance requirements." The first commutation came within 6 months. Death sentences were converted to life imprisonment, citing procedural concerns and diplomatic considerations. Life sentences were then reduced to fixed terms of 20 to 25 years. Those fixed terms were further reduced for good behavior and health considerations. By 1958, 5 years after trial, the last Oradour defendant was released from French custody. None of the 21 death sentences had been executed. None of the defendants served their full prison terms. The average time served was approximately 4.2 years for crimes that had killed 642 civilians. What I cannot reconcile is the evidentiary standard applied versus punishment delivered. The prosecution proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Darthout's forensic analysis was scientifically rigorous. Survivor testimony was consistent and corroborated. Documentary evidence, photographs, ammunition logs, burial records was irrefutable. The jury convicted based on overwhelming proof. Yet the sentences were commuted, reduced, and effectively nullified by political pressure that turned justice into diplomacy. This wasn't justice theater. This was justice sacrificed to realpolitik. The legal mechanics of sentence reduction reveal institutional bad faith. Good behavior provisions allowed prisoners to earn time reductions for cooperation and compliance. But cooperation with what? They'd been convicted of mass murder. There was no rehabilitation program for genocidal violence. Good behavior meant not causing problems in prison, which isn't atonement or transformation, it's minimal compliance. Yet it reduced sentences by years, transforming 12-year terms into 4-year terms, making mockery of the original sentences. Health considerations became another reduction mechanism. Prisoners over 60 claiming age-related ailments were granted medical releases. Some claims were legitimate, many weren't. Prison medical examinations were cursory, often politically influenced. Defendants who'd been healthy enough to commit atrocities in 1944 were declared too infirm for prison in 1956. The medical releases were diplomatic solutions disguised as humanitarian gestures, getting German nationals out of French prisons without explicit amnesty that would outrage French public opinion. Neussy Saint-Song received death threats from French veterans groups for being too harsh on Germans. The threats came from Frenchmen who felt Cold War alliance requirements outweighed accountability for wartime crimes. The judge was being threatened not for failing justice, but for attempting it. The threats revealed how thoroughly political considerations had corrupted public understanding of the trial's purpose. Justice for French victims mattered less than Franco-German cooperation. Dead civilians at Oradour were politically inconvenient memories that alliance building required forgetting. The international law framework established at Nuremberg explicitly stated that superior orders was not valid defense for crimes against humanity. The Bordeaux jury accepted that framework in reaching guilty verdicts. But French appeals courts and clemency boards undermined Nuremberg precedent through sentence reductions that effectively rewarded following superior orders. If you could claim you were following orders and your superior was dead or unavailable, you could get your sentence reduced to time served and walk free. The legal principle collapsed under political pressure. I find the trial's outcome more disturbing than outright acquittal would have been. Acquittal would have been honest failure of justice. Instead, Bordeaux produced conviction followed by systematic nullification, guilty verdicts rendered meaningless by commutations and reductions. The appearance of justice without substance of accountability. Victims' families attended trials, heard guilty verdicts, watched perpetrators sentenced to death or life imprisonment, then watched those perpetrators walk free within years. The emotional whiplash of that process, justice promised then betrayed, might be worse than no trial at all. By 1960, all Oradour defendants had been released. Heinz Lammerding, Das Reich commander during the massacre, had never been extradited from Germany. He lived openly in Dusseldorf, working as civil engineer, collecting Wehrmacht pension, never spending a day in French custody despite conviction in absentia. Other defendants returned to Germany, resumed civilian lives, and disappeared into post-war prosperity. Some attended SS veterans' reunions, sharing war stories with comrades who'd committed similar crimes in other locations. The trial's outcome hadn't deterred them or even inconvenienced them significantly. The trial transcripts were preserved in French judicial archives, documenting what the prosecution proved and what the defense claimed and what the verdicts declared and what political pressure accomplished. Reading those transcripts decades later reveals the gap between legal process and political outcome. The law said guilty. Politics said release them anyway. The transcripts document both truths, the guilt proven in court and the impunity granted outside it. Justice was delivered on paper and denied in practice, leaving archives full of verdicts that history knows weren't enforced. Chapter 17. The Living Ghosts. 1957. A government office in West Germany where a pension application sat on a bureaucrat's desk. The applicant, Heinz Lammerding, former SS Brigade Führer, commander of Das Reich during Oradour and Toul operations. The application requested retroactive military pension for service from 1935 to 1945. The section requesting disclosure of criminal convictions was marked None in Germany. Technically accurate because Lammerding's conviction had occurred in French court in absentia, not German court. The Pension Board, applying West German civil service regulations, approved the application. Monthly pension, 847 Deutschmarks. The man convicted of commanding operations that killed 741 French civilians was drawing government pension from the same government that had employed him during those killings. Between 1945 and 1951, Lammerding evaded French extradition requests by living openly in Dusseldorf under his own name. West German law prohibited extradition of German nationals to foreign courts, a provision designed to prevent political persecution but functioning as shield for war criminals. French Justice Ministry files, now declassified, show 14 separate extradition requests filed between 1946 and 1956. All denied. German courts ruled consistently. Lammerding was German national. Extradition prohibited, regardless of charges. France could convict him in absentia, but couldn't compel his presence for trial or imprison him after conviction. Otto Weidinger, regimental commander in Das Reich, took a different approach to post-war life. He became SS Veterans Movement spokesman. Between 1953 and 1971, Weidinger published multiple division histories, gave interviews to sympathetic journalists, and organized veterans reunions. His books, Division Das Reich, Volumes 1 through 5, presented the division as military formation fighting conventional war, minimizing or omitting atrocities, emphasizing combat against regular armies. The book sold well in West Germany, particularly among veterans seeking validation of their service without confronting its criminal aspects. The HIAG, Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, or Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, hosted annual Das Reich reunions from 1952 onward. Attendance ranged from 200 to 800 veterans, depending on year and location. The reunions featured speeches, memorial services for fallen comrades, and informal networking. Photographs from these events, preserved in HIAG archives that are now restricted access, show elderly men wearing Veteran Association insignia, sharing war stories, maintaining bonds formed during service. The photographs also show what's absent: any acknowledgement that the division they're commemorating committed systematic atrocities. West German denazification process, theoretically designed to prevent former Nazis from holding positions of influence, became bureaucratic whitewashing. Spruchkammer courts, denazification tribunals, classified 99.3% of SS applicants as followers rather than perpetrators, using the logic that most SS members had followed orders rather than created policy. The follower classification made them eligible for civil service employment, professional licenses, and pension benefits. The classification system was designed to reintegrate former Nazis into society, but it did so by minimizing individual responsibility and institutional guilt. What I find obscene about this system is its mathematical precision in avoiding accountability. Of approximately 12,000 Das Reich veterans who survived the war, 7 were executed. 89 served prison time, averaging 4.2 years. That's a meaningful punishment rate of 0.8%. 99.2% of survivors faced no significant legal consequences for service in a division that committed documented mass murder across multiple countries. The statistics prove systematic impunity, not isolated failures of justice. Lammerding worked as civil engineer in Dusseldorf from 1951 until retirement in 1968. His civilian career was successful. He held senior positions in construction firms, consulted on infrastructure projects, earned comfortable living. Colleagues knew his SS background. It wasn't secret. But Cold War West Germany was more interested in reconstruction than confronting past, and Lammerding's technical competence outweighed his criminal history in employers' calculations. He died peacefully in 1971 from natural causes, surrounded by family, having never spent a day in prison for Oradour.
His obituary in the Dusseldorf newspaper described him as decorated war veteran, without mentioning Orador specifically. The obituary noted his SS service, that couldn't be hidden, but framed it as conventional military career. No mention of mass civilian deaths, no mention of French conviction, no mention that the man being mourned had commanded operations that burned women and children alive in a church. The obituary was institutional amnesia, codified in newsprint, public forgetting masquerading as respectful remembrance. Otto Kuhm, whose diary documented his recognition of Budapest operations' futility, also published memoirs in the 1970s. His book, Prinz Eugen, The History of the 7th SS Mountain Division, focused on another unit he'd commanded, but included sections on Das Reich. Comparing his published memoir to his war diary reveals systematic editing. The fatalism is gone, replaced by conventional narratives of military professionalism. The admission that he obeyed suicidal orders from habit is absent. The published version presents a competent officer executing difficult missions, not a man trapped by institutional machinery he knew was grinding soldiers to death for no purpose. The gap between private documentation and public narrative appears across Das Reich veteran memoirs. Men who'd written letters home describing atrocities published books claiming ignorance of crimes. Officers who'd signed operational orders for reprisals wrote memoirs claiming they'd opposed such actions but been overruled. Enlisted men who'd been photographed at massacre sites claimed they'd been elsewhere during the events. The pattern suggests coordination, not formal conspiracy, but shared understanding that post-war survival required rewriting history to minimize criminal participation. Some veterans were more honest. A few published accounts acknowledged witnessing atrocities, though usually with exculpatory framing. "I saw terrible things, but was powerless to stop them." Or, "War brutalizes everyone, we were all victims." These partial acknowledgments serve to inoculate against more damning accusations while maintaining victim status. The memoirists positioned themselves as witnesses to atrocity rather than participants, observers who'd been present, but not complicit. The mathematical reality contradicts the memoir's claims. 642 died at Oradour, 99 died at Toul. Thousands died in Eastern Front operations. These killings required hundreds of direct participants: shooters, guards, fire setters, drivers, logistics personnel. Yet post-war, almost no one admitted direct participation. Everyone was elsewhere, or following orders, or opposed to violence but powerless. The math doesn't work. Atrocities on that scale require mass participation, but post-war narratives claim mass innocence. Someone's lying. The forensic evidence suggests almost everyone's lying. What disturbs me most is the comfortable retirements. Lammerding drawing pension until 1971. Weidinger publishing best-selling military histories. Kuhm consulting for defense industries. Other Das Reich veterans becoming successful businessmen, civil servants, professionals. They lived well, raised families, attended reunions, died peacefully. Meanwhile, Oradour orphans, children who'd watched mothers burn in church, carried childhood trauma into adulthood and old age. The perpetrators prospered, the victims suffered, and the legal system that should have redressed that imbalance instead enabled it. Lammerding's pension application approval crystallizes the systemic failure. The bureaucrat who approved it followed regulations correctly. The regulations were designed to provide for veterans regardless of wartime actions. The system worked as designed, which is precisely the problem. When systems are designed to prioritize administrative procedure over moral accountability, they produce outcomes like Lammerding receiving government pension for service that included commanding mass murder. The system wasn't broken. It was built to produce exactly that result. The living ghosts weren't the dead haunting the survivors. The living ghosts were the perpetrators who survived, thrived, and disappeared into comfortable obscurity. They attended veteran reunions, sharing memories of comrades in battles, carefully avoiding the memories of civilians they'd killed. They drew pensions, published memoirs, maintained respectability. They died peacefully in hospital beds, not in prison cells, having successfully evaded accountability through legal technicalities, political expediency, and institutional amnesia. The files remain in archives, pension applications approved, extradition requests denied, memoir publication records, reunion attendance logs, death certificates showing natural causes at advanced ages. The documentation proves impunity, preserves evidence of system designed to forgive rather than punish. We are still failing Ovadur, failing Toul, failing every victim of atrocities committed by men who lived comfortably after committing them, protected by legal systems that prioritized reconciliation over justice. The question isn't why some perpetrators escaped accountability. The question is why accountability was so rare that we can name the exceptions. The 7 executed, the 89 imprisoned, while the mass who faced no consequences remain anonymous in their comfortable impunity. Das Reich's legacy isn't military history. It's the normalization of evading consequences, the systematic construction of post-war narratives that allowed mass murderers to retire peacefully. That legacy persists in every modern war criminal living freely, despite international warrants, every atrocity unpunished, because politics trumps justice. History doesn't repeat, but the structures of avoiding accountability do. We're still building them, still enabling them, still failing to dismantle them, and Orador still burns.